children born into cults and left. What was your oh shit moment? My brother and I grew up in a cult family. Not specifically naming anything, but has since disbanded to my knowledge, though some of you all might know which town this happened in. Picture this, a rural town, middle of nowhere with only a handful of people. It was made very clear that outsiders weren't welcome, and we obviously didn't get many guests. The ones that stumbled upon it were lost. The town looked creepy as shit, so they cleared out fast. Contact to the rest of the world was non-existent, and we didn't have access to anything, no news, TV, etc. Here are some of the worst things that are burned into my memory. Live animal sacrifices were common. On special occasions, leaders cut them open and followers were required to eat a piece of the heart. One time, I threw up after the ceremony and was beaten. People got sick frequently, but weren't permitted to see a medical professional outside of the cult, but the doctors in the cult were absolute quacks. Education was handled by leaders, and whoever they appointed. My older brother really liked dragonflies and other insects. Our dad would capture them and force him to pluck the wings off as a sacrifice. It was typical for the members to be having sex with each other, consensual or not. Leaders and their favorites were allowed to rap. My brother and I knew our real parents, but we were taught to treat every adult as a parent. They turned a blind eye to the molestation of children. They would marry us teen/kids off informally to people within the cult. When I say informally, I mean there was no gov/legal work to back it up. We were just told that we would be marrying this person and didn't have a choice. I had a romantic and semi-sexual relationship with a teenage boy in the cult. I was slightly younger than him at the time. I became overly paranoid because it was against our religion to be engaging in same-sex relations. For a long time I thought I was going to die since he disappeared one day with no warning. I still have no idea what happened, if he got out by ditching in the middle of the night like I did, or if he was killed. Edit for clarification. I don't know what happened to my parents, but they are probably dead. I haven't seen my brother since that day. I have no way of contacting him if he's alive, and I don't even know where he'd be. I did enlist in the army, and the recruiter who got me in, the friend previously mentioned, worked his ass off with helping me get legal documentation. I gave him all the personal information I knew. We reached out to hospitals in the state, and eventually a document with my last name and parents popped up. I was fortunate enough to be in a state that only needed a statement that said you were that person in order to get a birth certificate. The recruiter also helped me obtain a student ID so I could get the other documentation I needed, social security card, etc. Note it wasn't an immediate transition from cult to military, though I understand why some of you might have thought that. One of my best friends today was raised into a freaky Afro-Islamic cult. He and his mom left when his dad was sent on a mission to Sudan. As it turned out, he was sent to fight in a civil war on behalf of the local tribe/cult. They never heard from him ever again. They assume he was killed in action. He described his childhood as animal sacrifices, usually goats, every Friday, and he was forced to eat the heart raw and drink the blood, else he would be beaten. The cult owned a house-turned-apartment building in Detroit where he lived, and said that his mother was never permitted to leave the building. He described how female genital mutilation was mandatory for all girls, which is especially faked up. Crazy to think of these kinds of things happening in the United States. When he was 8, he and his mom managed to escape the cult by stealing thousands of dollars in cash and fled in the middle of the night and paid a truck driver to smuggle them into Canada. They stayed in the country illegally for a month, slowly making their way from Ontario to British Columbia, where they smuggled themselves back across the border into Washington. There, they got support from a mosque, who set his mom up with a place to live and a job at a restaurant, and helped get my friend back into the school system and back into society. 4 years. They were paranoid as fuck, because they thought that the cult was going to hunt them down and kill them, but being dressed head to toe in a burqa has its advantages. I guess she was able to hustle at the job, and through financial support from the mosque he was able to attend college, where we met. He's working at a bank now, and doing really well for himself. He's getting married soon, and he's fully supporting his mother as well. My mother and I had a conversation about how cute babies are, and she mentioned that the sweet, innocent, lovable nature of infants makes a mother forget the nearly lethal experience of the labor. She kissed my cheek and called me angel. I asked her why. Then, I was born. If my elder brother's birth was so terrifying and painful for her, Deuteronomy 5:16 roughly says that children who honor their father and mother as God says, therefore honoring God too, will be blessed, and the parents are therefore blessed by having a respectful child. In the cult, job descriptions and qualifications include scriptures. My father wanted a job, and one of the requirements was that his children respect him and fear the Lord. But he only had one child at the time. He was told he would not get the promotion until he had another child, and my mother was accosted several times, being told she was selfish, a hellish woman, worse than Eve, that her vagina was a hole to hell. That is not an exaggeration. It was a common insult in the cult, along with calling others uncircumcised and haughty, because people in cults speak with marked peculiarity. She had several panic attacks, and finally stuck off to find a psychiatrist and renew her use of the anxiety medication she was on before my father made her stop taking them. Once I was conceived, my father was promoted, and they were transferred to what was at the time the USSR. My brother was left with, honestly I don't know who, and my parents won't tell me, but they left for the remainder of her pregnancy. Against medical advice, they flew back to the US, and I was born in Illinois. For the next 5 years we were left with strangers, who were ranked highly enough in the cult to take care of the children of my father's ranking, until we were assigned secondary parents. Give about 13 years, and I had a secret and god-awful boyfriend who did not understand consent, but then again neither did I. Well, one day I walked home after a rough date, and upon going to the bathroom I found blood, and realized it was nowhere near my period time. I told my mother, and she said, "That is what happens with men," and went to her room. The next Friday I felt so disgusting that I wanted to purge myself, die to myself, and give my life to the cult, so I confessed everything about how impure I was to the female leaders. One told me I know nothing of pain, and because of my father's ranking I lie for attention. The other said she would not trust me to hold her own child, which is a very insulting this to tell any female who has menstruated, as it is your primary function in the cult to care for your own and other children. It is worse than telling someone that their very existence is inherently meaningless. And the third said my presence was detrimental to the souls of those around me, so I'm to leave and not return. And since I'm a liar, of anyone fully in the cult ask me what happened to lie, or they will say I'm a whore and a liar. I missed the next 3 periods until one day I was sitting in our living room in an expensive house in Southern California, paid for by the forced tithe of those who could barely feed their own children, and I started to bleed. A lot. And then vomit. And then I could barely crawl, so I laid in the bathroom until it was over. I thought I was going to die, and I was happy about it. I woke up in the bathroom, cleaned up, and went to school. My secondary sister snuck me pain meds from the medicine cabinet. Father is prone to migraines. I told my parents what happened that Thursday. My mother started crying, but my father stopped her. She said that, right after she had my brother, she conceived again, twins. But she lost them, bled them out like a curse. My father told her that she had killed the wrong child, and they left me to process it. I didn't have any tears or anger, just sort of a sharp clarity that since hadn't left me. They later told me they were proud of me because I didn't cry, but needed time to process the death of the wrong daughter. In case you want more reading, International Church of Christ, ICC/COC/ICOC. There are plenty of articles and documentaries. I have countless more stories if you'd like. Edit, spelling. Like others, my experience maybe wouldn't be categorized as a true cult, but the whole think like the herd and don't question God's plan really made me feel like it. It was a fairly mainstream religion, but so robotic and hypocritical I'd still consider a faked up way to be. The things that started it for me was a teacher at the private school run by the church, insisting, rather cruelly, that my pets can't go to heaven because they have no souls. I was 6 and felt like it was just a heartless thing to do. Also, the sexism. This was reflected in the dress code policy, the whole idea that girls carry the responsibility to be wholesome and not tempting in any way. by wearing long skirts, no sleeveless shirts, etc. Also, the teacher saying mean and hurtful things to students, body shaming, before it was ever called that, or thin-built girl for being too skinny, making fun of the poor kids for being less well-kept than the other students, bad-mouthing students publicly, humiliating corporal punishment. I have no idea where the religious messages of Jesus' love fit in there, because I sure didn't hear it much. Only the abuse from the pious staff. Edit. Oh seat, I just remembered. They spouted a lot of soon you'll be required to take the mark of the beast, an implant in your hand or forehead, but you must resist and be willing to die for the church. I only recently found out that the whole mark of the beast thing was based on a totally hypothetical fictional film from the 70s some pastor made, who later said it was a work of fiction, but by then it was already too late and many fundamentalist church groups took it and ran with it. I always imagine a cult as people wearing dark robes and chanting around an altar for something a little sinister, so I'm not really sure what qualifies as a cult, but this might point qualifiers right now. I'm a Methodist, which is a pretty low-key Christian denomination. I've never been to a church with a priest, always a preacher. I dated a girl a while ago whose family were longtime members of what one might label a very fundamentalist Christian sect. As far as I know, the only members of this group are in this one city in Texas, where we both lived at the time, and it's a very Christian city with a little bit of a history with extremist Christian groups. Her stepfather was normally pretty curt to her mother whenever I saw them together, and according to her he was pretty verbally abusive to her when others weren't around. Her group's priest, when she went to him for some counseling on leaving him, told her to just love him and suffer through it, because that's what their scripture said. Their whole group was pretty heavily in on women, remain subservient to men in all scenarios. Now, for the definitively cult-wide things, their scripture was the Bible, but cherry-picked to get rid of some things, and with a few extra books, added that their priest had stuck in, because he'd had visions that told him to do so. The members needed permission from the priest to leave the church, and they had to do a period of counseling with him before even looking into a separation, much less an actual divorce. They had a few homes where college-age kids in the church could live together while going to the local university. The students who were around when I was in school weren't bad people as far as I can tell, just a little hipster. Why? They did have mandated worship and prayer time every single morning. My girlfriend lived there for a year before we dated because the rent was super low, and she later said that they really freaked her out. My family broke off from the main LDS church in the 60s or 70s because it wasn't conservative enough for them. I don't know if I'd fully categorize it as a cult, but it was bad. Really bad. Most Mormons I know now and have talked to about it are flabbergasted by it. They cherry-picked rules and ideas from a bunch of various conservative movements, but most of our religious ideology was based around Mormonism. I knew I had to get out when Matthew Shepard got murdered, and my parents considered his killers to be doing the Lord's work. As a very young boy who already knew he was gay, it was a rude awakening that they considered murderers in the right over a gay guy who hadn't done anything wrong. I waited it out until college. Somehow, I managed to convince my parents to let me go to a secular school states away. I came out and was told I needed to quit school and come home for an ex-gay program or be kicked out of the family, and chose the latter. I haven't spoken to any of my family in years outside of an uncle who escaped as well, except once when my sister called to inform me my mother died, then asked for money to help pay for a funeral I wasn't allowed to attend. I told her I wouldn't do it unless me and my fiance could go, and she hung up on me. I do creep on my cousin's Facebook though. She married a guy who is a normal Mormon, apparently, and is now allowed to use the internet. Except for her, every member of my family I've seen in pictures looks miserable. Oh man. Here's my time to shine. I was born into a radical Pentecostal church during the early 80s and 90s, when exorcism was a thing. They would perform these during church and home groups on Sunday nights. It was always interesting to watch, because the people would go all out, talking in a different demon voice, ushers needing to hold them down, and convulsing on the floor. It was Sunday night, and I was at our youth pastor's house for home group. I was 14. After the singing and praise, the youth pastor started his speech. There's someone here who's been backsliding away from God. They've changed and seem to have blah blah blah. I remember thinking, oh, who's it going to be today? And that's when I heard my name called, and, can you please come to the middle? Definitely took me off guard, but like a good sheep I went. Everyone gathered around me, started putting hands on me, and speaking in tongues. Then the youth pastor placed one hand on my back, and the other on my stomach. As it started to kick off, getting louder and louder, that's when the youth pastor started to give me the Heimlich. Basically getting his hand all up under my ribcage. It hurt and only got worse. I was thinking to myself, how the hell am I going to get out of this? So, I faked being slain in the Holy Spirit, and fell to the ground. I stayed still and everyone backed off, and continued praising the Lord. What felt like an eternity, I was grabbed by the arms and they moved me to a different room. I waited a bit longer, and finally got up, and left. I haven't been to church since I'm 39. I didn't grow up in a cult, but I did grow up cult adjacent. My parents were long-term missionaries, meaning they did it all the time, not like 6-month or even 2-year stints, and part of a missionary team. There were 3 other families on their missionary team. 2 were culty, 1 was normal. I mean, normal for someone who is dedicating their lives, and their children's lives in part, to living in a foreign country to indoctrinate the natives. But, yeah, no, it's all relative. The first time I clearly remember thinking beaches be crazy was when I was in 2nd or 3rd grade. The mom of one of the crazy families was teaching Sunday school. Sunday school that day consisted of the mom, me, my sister, and maybe another boy. She was lecturing us about secular music versus godly music. Except it wasn't about the lyrics, it was about the actual music. Not, like, rock music or drums are bad. Nope, that I would have been like, well, that's disappointing but okay. Instead, she was going on and on about how songs that didn't definitively end, I guess songs that faded out, would get stuck on your head, and you'd repeat them over and over without meaning. Which was bad because chanting, I think, chanting was of the devil, and spells used chanting, and the devil would control your mind that way. And then there was a whole thing about a certain number of beats being sinful, but as I was very young, tone deaf, and literally don't even like music, I just fully zoned out at this point and just smiled and nodded at the appropriate points. But I distinctly remember thinking she was insane. Just well and truly nuts. I was pretty concerned about her level of crazy, because I told my dad about it. And he was like, don't worry about it, you don't have to believe that. Which of course leads to the thought, if we don't have to believe that, what else do we not have to believe? Turns out a lot of it, when you grown up to be a heathen. Late to the party, but I wanted to participate. I was born into the Mormon cult. I never got into it, despite growing up in it for 17 years. Never truly believed any of it, just went along with all the nonsense. To make my life easier to answer your question, my oh shit moment, the moment I realized it's actually a cult, not a religion, was when I was 17, and I reread my patriarchal blessing for sheets and giggles. I had already told my mom I was an atheist a few months prior to this. She didn't take it well, but I pulled out the letter one day. It reads like an indoctrination contract. If you don't know what this thing is, it's because no one is supposed to talk about them. They are private blessings you receive that usually you'd only share with a parent or sibling. To get your blessing, you go to the stake patriarch when you're old enough, 16 I think, maybe younger. I got mine late. You go to this old faker's home where places his hands on your head and spouts drivel for a few minutes, in my case, while his wife transcribed it. Anyway, after several uncomfortable minutes of divine fantasy, it's over, and a week or so later, they mail you the transcription. First, the document didn't sound anything like the sheet he was spouting. This thing is basically supposed to be a roadmap of your life. It started off saying, how great of a life I've had so far, loving and caring family, my dad was an asshole, Methuselah, literally never got along with him. We are cool now though. So, that first part was complete bullshit. Flag 1. It goes on to tell me which ancient tribe of Israel I belong to, and how I'm gonna get married, and have half a dozen kids, and have a fantastical, fulfilling life, but only if I go on a mission. Bottom line, it was a missionary recruitment contract. Mentions going on a mission half a dozen times, and contains facts about my life that are complete hogwash points. So yeah, that was the oh shit moment. This caused me to reflect on the entirety of my experience growing up. Point in church, every single Sunday in uncomfortable clothes for an arduous 3 faking hours. We sat through sacrament meeting for the first hour. Basically the most boring activity ever contrived, where people stood at the pulpit giving talks or discussing church matters. During this, the young men, deacons, aged 13 to 15 walk around passing out bread and water to the congregation, which was prepared by the priests, 16 plus during a hymn. The second hour, we are split into classes, based on our age group, for another hour-long brainwashing seminar. The third hour we are split again, men in one class, women in another. To add to this, in high school, we had to attend seminary, which was an elective, which we did not get elective credits for, so I had to take an extra class every year to graduate. So every single day, we got an hour of Jesus pumped into us on top of church. Shouldn't be legal, imo. The icing on the indoctrination cake was something called the Pioneer Trek, which occurs every 4 years. All the youth with volunteer adults spend a few weeks building Motherfucking pioneer handcarts with giant metal wheels to be pulled manually with 1,000-pound payloads through the forest. This was the bane of my existence, which my parents forced me to participate in. They gathered us all up, we dressed in actual pioneer clothes, think Little House on the Prairie, to head up to the mountains. For several days, we were put into families assigned to a cart with all of our shit. No electronics allowed. We had to push and pull these cars, often off actual trails, through the woods for miles and miles. This took several days. At one point, we had to climb like a 50-degree incline up what I'd consider to be a cliff. We tied the obscenely heavy cart with ropes and pushed/pulled each cart up the hill. Very dangerous. Later on, the men were called away to the Mormon battalion, Civil War sheet, I think, and the women had to push the carts alone for a bit. Same sheet later on for the guys, but our trail was infinitely harder. It was freezing, hailing/raining during the men only push. Literally out the side of a cliff, over boulders and sheet, probably the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I was damp or wet, and freezing most of this trip. At night, only the women got tents, so I had to sleep by myself on a tarp that I folded over myself in an attempt to block the furious wind. I would not have been able to fall asleep, freezing as I was, if I wasn't so exhausted. I realize now that this entire event was contrived as an elaborate way to break the will and mind of the participants in order to fill the empty spaces with more and more Jesus, masquerading as a fun unity event. Point longer than I thought it was gonna be. Sorry, and I left out a lot. Back in the late 90s, some friends/coworkers of mine were involved with a local church that bordered on cult status. They kept trying to get me to go to one of their services with them, talking about how great the sermons were, how the community within Hebrew was very welcoming, etc. I was agnostic at the time and skeptical because of a few things they also told me, but I went to check it out myself. At first everything seemed like any other church-friendly people, charismatic pastor, singing, praying, etc. But then I noticed things were weird when the pastor started speaking in tongues and the entire congregation did as well on cue. This happened at least 3 times during the service, and each time, everyone in the church besides me joined in. The church also encouraged all but forced young members to join their religion school to receive a degree in faith. The school was pretty expensive, around $2,000 in 1997, or about $3,100 today, which caused most members to take out a loan from the church to pay for. Members in their early 20s were not allowed to date or fraternize in any way with the opposite sex while in school. The church even rented out multiple apartments in a local complex where students were housed together. Non-members were not allowed to rent rooms or be in the apartment without a chaperone. I think what bothered me most was how intrusive the church was in these young people's lives. They required the members to report their incomes, demanded tithes, and regulated every aspect of the members' lives. I'm a little late, but here it goes. My family and I shared a house with a group of nuns in the Philippines, a country deeply into their superstitions. The group leader, who we shall name Sister Teresa, would profess that either baby Jesus, adult Jesus, Father God, the Holy Spirit, and the Virgin Mary would consume/possess her. Never all at once, but either personality once every few weeks. Word got around, and people from the local parish would flock our house to experience the phenomenon. I even remember the Monsignor blessed our house and there would be celebrations on occasion. I was around 7 at the time, and was involved in the choir. In truth, I enjoyed those times when people would gather and sing. That was the only thing that I took pleasure in, singing. The rest of it, I thought to be silly. One afternoon, I mimicked and made fun of Sister Teresa's shtick to my brother during our playtimes and our mom caught us. Since I was the instigator, my mom, who despite being a woman of science was a believer in all of this, told Sister Teresa one day that I was a doubting Thomas. So one random morning, during breakfast, Sister Teresa did her shtick and was going to prove to me that I was now talking to baby Jesus. Baby Jesus asked one of the nuns to get him a piece of Hershey's Kisses. He prayed over it before biting into the chocolate. He said something to me to the effect of "you will see." Then baby Jesus left Sister Teresa's body. She then showed it to me to take a look at the teeth marks on the chocolate, to which I remarked, "Why are they so big?" They all glared at me like I was Damien or something, but a year or so later, fewer and fewer people stopped coming. Sister Teresa frequented her province more and more until she completely moved out, although some of the nuns still lived with us. After going to church one Sunday, I asked my mom about her, and she looked at me almost embarrassingly and said she had a nervous breakdown. There was no single point I remember when I was very young asking my mom how we knew this religion was the right one and her telling me it was because it was the only one with a history of real miracles. Of course that history was only documented in the Bible, a logical fallacy I recognized on some level even then, but couldn't express. There was a weird moment when a lady in the church berated me for having a book with sorceress in the title and tried to convince me to throw it away. That whole thing left a discomfort I also wouldn't fully understand until I was older. It was high school that did it, and though learning about evolution and seeing how much sense it made prompted me to do some further research. Learning that there were active civilizations in the past when our doctrine claimed they would have been destroyed by the flood, and any questions I raised about that got hand waved by dating inaccuracies. Accounts like when Joshua stopped the sun having no parallels in other cultures. The whole logical ridiculousness of the Ark story. It just didn't make sense. The final nail was when I got a girlfriend. We would do the whole horny teen routine and make out before we had to catch our buses, and a lady in the church saw us. The next time I attended, I was taken aside by some elders who tried to explain the errors of my ways. After that I was just fed up and stopped going. My mom didn't take well to that. It was a hard few years before I finally was old enough to leave. A lot of aggressions and running away from home, only to be dragged back by the cops. I left the day I turned 18. I told her that morning, and she didn't even look up from the TV, just said good luck. Late to the party, but I wanted to chip in. The cult in question was basically my father declaring he was the son of God and indoctrinating my brother, mother and myself into thinking so too. This was just the base state of the family. I can't remember him not forcing that sheet on us. There were multiple "oh sheet" moment growing up. I was never allowed to have friends. I was only allowed to have "allies." My father would punish me every time I used the word friend. These people were only allowed to be called "acquaintances." He would beat me because I was one of those people who didn't understand anything other than violence. Read, a child, and would send my mother afterwards to sort me out and get me to go and apologize for making him so angry. This was fine in his God's eyes. My father believed mental illnesses were a weakness of character, that you were just being weak and lazy, so your symptoms of depression, or what have you, was just you being a worthless, lazy husk who couldn't be asked to feel happy. During my teens I was suffering from what I now know to be depression and anxiety, and hearing that all the time really faked me up. On a similar note, I wasn't allowed to cry or be sad or angry because the gods hadn't given me any problems. It was me just being ungrateful. Point being mocked ruthlessly at school for parroting my father's beliefs about science and evolution. It's all bullshit, don't you know? Whenever I was crushing on someone, my mother would tell me that the gods would bring us together, but only if I learned to be domesticated, read, slave, to serve my potential partner every single time I was hurt. It was because the gods were punishing me. Once when I was about 8 or 9, he, accidentally, if you believe it, ran me over with my aunt's car. It was divine punishment for being snappy at him and being indecisive. He laughed at me and told me I was stupid for having hobbies and finding psychology interesting, stating that psychology is bullshit and anyone who thinks it isn't is a faking moron. The last and final straw was when my sister-in-law asked my father to leave off holding her newborn son for about 30 minutes because he'd just had a cigarette and she was worried about the fumes. He carried on as normal, but after my brother and his family had left, my father sent him a nasty email stating that his partner was toxic, that he'd had enough of her "beachiness and constant disrespect." He stated she was a "codependent personality" and was bringing my brother down. He ended the email with a link to a page about "how to terminate a relationship with a codependent person." My brother called me up and explained to me what had happened and that he was going to cut ties. I followed suit a month later, having finally built up the courage. Since then, my father has been going around telling my friends' parents that he was told by God that my brother and I had always been "rotten" and he's glad to be rid of us. I'm doing much better now. It's been about 2 years since I've spoken to them. I've been seeing a therapist and trying to undo all the damage he caused over the years. I'm in a much better place now. I just had my oh shit moment a few months ago. I've been an atheist / don't really care for my entire adult life, but I was raised in an ashram. My parents were incredibly involved in the ashram and completely looked up to the guru. My father passed away a few years ago, but my mother is still just as involved, donating money, doing the practices now at 72 as she was when she joined at 28. Even though I stepped away from the ashram, I always thought they were fine and made my mother happy, so to each their own. Then, a few months ago, my mother tells me she needs to get something off her chest. Apparently, the right-hand man of the guru rapped her, and that's my real father. She says she never told anyone because she wanted a baby so badly that the guru made this happen just so she could have a baby, since the man that raised me couldn't get her pregnant. It was both infuriating and incredibly heartbreaking to hear her put so much faith into her beliefs in this manner, to realize that she was so brainwashed, to not only not ask for help at the time, but to see this as some sort of gift. After she told me this, I reached out to a swami that used to be a big part of the ashram. I honestly don't know what I was expecting, but the man that raised me is dead, and my apparent real father / mother's rapist is also dead, and my mother refused to talk to me about it anymore because I was so upset. The swami basically mirrored what my mother said. If that's what happened, it was for the best. The guru is all knowing, blah blah blah. People need to be held responsible for their actions. You can't explain away a rap in this manner. I understand that it was a different time, and there could have been other things keeping my mom from speaking up, but her main reason for why she didn't was because she truly believed that on a spiritual level the guru wouldn't allow something to happen within the ashram that wasn't supposed to. I don't even know what to do with this information, but mostly I feel incredibly sad for my mom. Was living with a girl in a flat share for a while. We took in her good friend, a Turkish girl who left home because of her tyrant father. It escalated when he slapped her one day for being a rebel. Well, not a rebel in the traditional sense. She was exceptionally good in school and very clever, polite, and pretty. Everything started going downhill in her family when she told her parents that she doesn't believe in their faith. She never wore a headscarf, so the family must have been little more progressive and rejects the conservative culture in general. She told them she wants to have a career, travel the world, etc. The dad obviously had other plans that included an arranged marriage. Once she lived with us, the harassment started. Angry messages on our answering machine, plants broken, car door keyed, and visits and encounters with the larger family that included an angry younger brother that threatened us repeatedly with physical violence. We had no evidence for the broken stuff, but one day, when the family was frantically knocking on our door demanding to take her home, we recorded it and called the police. The father told the police we kidnapped her to pimp her out, but the police got a pretty good understanding what was going on. They had a serious word with the family. We never pursued further action, such as pressing charges, as it was already a stressful situation for the girl. Luckily the harassment stopped, and her mom even came to apologize with clothes and food. Last thing I know, she moved to her aunt's place, who was a modern woman teaching at an university, and who got estranged from the family as well. I really hope she could follow her dreams and leave crazy family behind her. I wasn't in a cult by the means of what most people think, but I grew up in a super judgmental, manipulative and verbally abusive close-knit religious fellowship that were Christian, but the main lady who kind of started is batshit crazy. Like, I have too many examples of things, and there were a lot of okay, this isn't right, this isn't what God, who I don't really believe in anymore, would be like moments. So this sheet gave so much anxiety. People would get in trouble or yelled at for the weirdest things, and it took me a while to realize that the opinion of one person doesn't matter in the scheme of things, but this woman had a very demanding presence and people would just start agreeing with her, even if they didn't, which my mom would do a lot. The main reason my parents divorced was because of the fellowship. The women in the group were terrible gossips and everyone knew everything, and my dad couldn't take having everyone weigh in on their marriage. I never dressed provocative as a teen, not that it warrants any harassment, but I was called a hoe so much, and was yelled at for wearing too much mascara, because she thought I was wearing mascara to lure guys to like me. Like what? I was called a beach, stupid, you name it. But of course there were certain people who thought their children were perfect. I think the one example that makes me the most upset is this. For some background, my brother is 2 years older than me, and we've always been pretty close, especially when we were older. The place we had Bible study at was at a friend's motel they owned, so we would help out by cleaning their pool, and we would still have to do it before Sunday school. One morning I was running late, and I told my brother to go ahead and go and start cleaning, cause I had to shower and I would catch with him later to help finish. My brother and I were both late and didn't get the pool cleaned in time. So we got yelled at, and this one girl starts telling me all about mine and my brother's relationship and says I take advantage of him, which I didn't, and all I could think was, you have no idea how our relationship really is. It made me mad cause my brother is really timid and didn't defend me, and he's still wrapped up in the fellowship, and so is my mom. So I'm not close with either of them, because that life brings me a lot of awful painful memories, and my dad and I have the best relationship and love that we are no longer a part of that crazy group. Oh, also I was still living at my mom's house, and when my mom found out about me having sex, I was 20 years old, she called me a hoe and basically kicked me out of the house. Also they were super against cuss words, but if someone was being yelled at it was righteous anger, like they would say fuck or shit, or whatever 4-letter word, but it was okay for them to use, I guess. Edit. Also when my dad was first separated from my mom, he stayed at the motel for a bit, and they asked him to do some chores to help out, which would have been okay I guess, but he was working 3 jobs at the time. Getting home from Domino's and going to sleep at 4 AM and then being woken up to do some task. He hated it and got his own apartment. I don't know if people agree that Mormonism is a cult, but look into it and you might change your views. Anyway, I first got super weirded out when my parents quit attending church due to marriage problems, and I started to go with a neighbor. No big deal. Except one day, instead of taking me to the car, she carts me off to the bishop's office for an interview I hadn't been warned about, and neither had my parents. I was asked if I kept chaste, and when I wasn't sure what that meant, I was 11. He asked me if I masturbated or let other people touch me, cause it was a sin if we did that sort of thing. I'd been assaulted when I was 7 by some creep, and I thought the bishop knew about it and that's why he was asking, but I hated to talk about it, so I said I was chaste, and whatever. My face was on fire, I was so embarrassed, an 11-year-old little girl being asked that shit by an old man, alone in an office with him. I was kinda panicked too about it all. After the whole thing, when I was 7, I didn't like being around men I don't know. This was the first time in my year of living there that I'd met this bishop. So he finally accepted my answers and then let me go out to find my neighbor, and I spent the night crying and apologizing to God for lying, cause I was so scared about not being with my family in heaven due to my lying. Anyway, I quit liking church as much after that, but I went until I was 13. My parents split, and one thing about Mormons is they love gossip, so there was a lot of crap said about my parents to me, and I was just like, no point. Also, baptisms for the dead. Weird as fact to me. Their temple rituals. Weird. Bishops interviewing kids alone without parents' permission and asking me if I touch myself. Not cool. My neighbor was a JW. She left at 20 when her husband struck her. Divorce was an automatic excommunication. She went to her parents' house, told them she loved them, but he would kill her if she stayed. Her parents gave her the money to leave the state, and she was gone by morning. Thankfully she was allowed some education, and her job sector is always hiring. She said she was tipped off that it wasn't right when she heard all her classmates talking about birthday parties. She had her first birthday party on her 25th birthday. My husband wasn't raised in a cult, but his church started turning culty in his late teens. He was a youth group leader, went to church every week, did all the extracurricular stuff. Whenever someone was in need they'd do extra collections and food runs. Then the minister passed away, and his son took up leadership, started following a mega church. Convinced the congregation that the savings they had put aside for a new church building would be better spent buying the minister and his family a house. My husband had some serious health issues, and almost the entire congregation ghosted the family. By the time my husband was well enough to return, the rest of his family had taken the hint and told him not to bother returning. I don't know that I ever fully bought into the cult, so I didn't really ever have a singular oh shit moment. A few things. I was rapped when I was 5. I was essentially told that it was all in my head and was shamed for thinking such things. The abuse continued off and on for almost a decade. As I got older, I never got it. I thought this was a byproduct of being bad because, you know, sect equals bad. And I didn't understand rap. It had to be happening to me because I invited / wanted it / whatever. My own father informed me that he couldn't listen or respect what I said because my toenails were painted a natural color because I had some kind of skin issue growing up and my toenails were awful. A friend at my high school bought me some nail polish to cover them up because I was so ashamed of them. Watching a woman get absolutely ostracized and forbidden from taking part in any church services or communions because she left her husband. He was beating the shit out of her. He continued to be welcomed with open arms. He was the victim, of course. My parents inviting a known rapist onto their property for a yearly cult gathering. The man had been encouraged not to attend cult gatherings in his home state because what he'd done was so widespread and had become public knowledge. Going back to visit my home state for a cult gathering and seeing my rapist, happy as a clam, getting all kinds of sympathy because his worldly wife had left him and taken the kids. Meanwhile, I was all but shunned because I dared to trim my hair and wear mascara. I grew up in the International Church of Christ. They tend to love bomb new visitors and suck people into private Bible studies. After gaining your trust and making you feel like they know the truth, they slowly wear you down with questions until you tell them all of your sins. I didn't realize how strange this sounded, nor did I notice how controlling the church was on members until I moved for college and wanted to date outside of the cult. I decided to leave since we weren't supposed to date non-members, and because I was far away from the larger congregation I was able to get out of it easier. Others, including a family member, weren't so lucky. About a year or two after leaving, by this time an atheist, I started searching my dad's cult up online. Well, they were investigated several times in the 90s, showing up on several major networks, and watching the undercover journalist and the interviews with members and former members. I realized how crazy they were and how, despite their claims, nothing had changed in over 15 years. Very happy now though, and although it made things difficult as an adolescent, considering how involved I was, I'm at least glad I've learned from the experience and truthfully believe I'm a stronger person for it. Feel free to ask questions and I can elaborate a bunch. I could probably write a book on my experience but will need to remain somewhat vague in certain details. So given all the great stories here, here's a halfway decent list of ways you know that a religious group is not a cult and will not fuck up your life. 1. They encourage rather than demonize education. If being educated, learning facts, and understanding science and history are things they encourage, you're on the right track. 2. They encourage, rather than discourage, being part of your family and larger community. Any faith group will want you to hang out with them and do cool stuff and boring stuff like business meetings and liturgy meetings. But if they also encourage you to try to have healthy relationships with family, friends, and the rest of the world, especially community service that is not preaching or saving people, that's a good sign. 3. They are not 100% sure they're right. Look, I get it. Believing that your religion has all the answers is comforting, but the more they are sure of themselves, and the more concrete that stuff is, the greater the possibility they are totally bullshit. For example, if they are totally sure the world will end next Thursday, they're probably bullshit. And, of course, you'll know that when the world doesn't end. If it does, boy will I feel foolish. If you are around people who often say, well, obviously we don't know for sure, but here's what we think, then you're doing okay for sect. Let me just say that very few faiths are about sect, and if the leaders of your group are having a whole lot of sect with the people in your group, that's probably not okay. Now I don't want to imply that any sect is a red flag. A religious group is basically a collection of adults who hang out together and have stuff in common. Some of them will bone, but that should be the exception, not the rule. And consent is super important here. If you feel like you would not be allowed to say no, that's not okay. 5. Hate. Let's be clear. Any group that preaches racism, homophobia, sexism, etc. is problematic and that's a huge red flag. If they try to control the lives of those people, especially people that are not part of their faith group, that's a huge problem. Now that doesn't make a group a cult, but it does make them assholes, and as long as we are making a list. In doubt this will get seen, but I wasn't really in a cult. It was just me and my mother really. She went through very religious phases. I was never really allowed to go trick or treating, wasn't allowed to watch Bewitched, I Dream of Jeannie was fine, wasn't even allowed to watch He-Man, although she did read Lord of the Rings to me as a child. Our church was a hands in the air, born again, sometimes flop or speak in tongues church. Funny story there actually. I once went to a boys retreat, I think I may have been 10, and a firebrand preacher got everyone so wound up about how speaking in tongues was the only way to be saved. Some of the older boys that night went from tent to tent and forcibly held us down and prayed over us, hands on, until we spoke in tongues. I begged God. I cried and I begged and pleaded, and I shut my eyes so tight and clenched me teeth so hard that my entire face hurt. My hands hurt from making fists. There were so many other hands on me, praying aloud. I was so scared and ashamed that I just faked it, and they were happy. I was ashamed still though, ashamed that God didn't give me that ability even though I begged. They were misguided and trying to do right by me. I don't blame them, but I never really told anyone until I was much older. The real time it hit me was the second time I had pneumonia. My mother found the 2 magic and voodoo books I had bought. I bought them for curiosity, not to practice it, and immediately burned them. She also found the Merced's Lackey book I was reading, but I managed to save that one. Then when I wound up with pneumonia she decided to treat me at home. She was an EMT, so that was okay I guess to me. The hospital was just 5 minutes away at most. I had a high fever and was in a lot of pain and in and out of consciousness, but I remember clearly her telling me that it was because I had forsaken God and he had withdrawn his protection from me. I needed to repent and remember and regain his love and protection. I was 16 at the time I think. My mother was misguided too, just like those boys, but that was the real moment I woke up and decided to move out. I left at 18. and I still call my mother. We have a good relationship mostly. Edit. On revival nights the crowd would go to the front and kneel and pray, so I got pressured into doing that a lot. The good thing is that the visiting preacher would usually do a hands on your forehead and pray thing to make you faint in the spirit. I did that a lot because I could trust fall backwards into waiting arms, get a blanket put over me, and take a small nap maybe. It was like a fair ride. Go up, fall down, lay for a bit, go back to my seat, repeat. I was a Jehovah's Witness. Born and raised. Got baptized. Sucks you in when you're a teenager. Trains you to be brainwashed. To hate yourself. To listen to the authority of the elders and the faithful and discreet slave. Go to meetings at the Kingdom Hall 2 times a week. Sit and listen. Participate to be a good Christian. Go out in service. Preach to others about the paradise and how this world is wicked and you'll die if you don't convert to Jehovah. I did this, but with little effort. It never really felt right. There was so much I could not do. Stifled and suppressed. So this coffee shop opens up right around my neighborhood and I went in and became good friends with the owner, who gently talked to me about how the religion is basically faked up. The J-dubs are not supposed to look at anything on the internet that talks negatively about the organization, cult. That would be called apostasy, and all that info online is Satan's work. Well, after many talks with coffee shop man, I went into work one day with the intent of it just being another day. I was a receptionist in the evening for a nursing home. I had full access to the web, looked up Jehovah's Witnesses, and came across an article I would have never clicked on if I hadn't been seriously skeptical and questioning my faith. It was a huge blog. This man named Daniel Jenser had written all about the apostasy and his reasons for leaving. This cult is your life. It's not easy finding out you've been living in all these lies and hypocrisy. I was like, oh shit. I printed out the article to its entirety and treasured it. Read the whole thing that night. It all clicked. The cult is so cynical and backwards. I almost couldn't believe it. But it became all too real to me. I couldn't stay any longer. Once you see the truth, it's almost impossible to stay involved. So I was kicked out of home 3 days after they grew suspicious. Which was alright with me. I was free. And they are miserable. It's sad. I'm lucky. If you read this, I apologize for the length. This kind of question has always bothered me because I have an extremely hard time viewing my upbringing through that lens. I grew up in what I can only explain as an extreme version of a Pentecostal church. Outside of school, my brothers and I rarely had contact with people outside of the church. Women weren't allowed to cut their hair, wear pants, or even wear skirts that showed their calves. We had abstinence hammered into our minds to the point where it became difficult for me to even be with a girl by myself, because one thing might lead to another. I have a very vivid memory of when I was young and had a wet dream. Up until that point in my life, I hadn't even masturbated, which was a difficult task for a kid going through puberty. When I woke up and realized what had happened, I cried. I felt so much guilt from something that was totally out of my control that I had anxiety for weeks afterwards. When I finally mustered up the courage to talk to my dad about what had been bothering me, he told me that we all sin, even on accident. I spent the next month repenting for what I had done. The rapture/second coming of Christ was always impending, and there was no escaping it. I kept a journal when I was younger, and there are multiple entries where I begged God to let me just experience high school. I grew up thinking that there was no way I would get to live a complete life on this earth. Spare the rod, spoil the child wasn't a quote for us, it was our reality. I remember the first time I told my soon-to-be fiancé about a time when my mom really lost it on my brothers and I. I honestly thought it was kind of a funny story until I saw how she was reacting to it. My friends and I showed off bruises from beatings like they were battle scars. We were honestly proud of them. Where my church really starts to look like a cult is how much it encroached into our personal and social lives. We attended regular services 4 times a week and had a prayer meeting at midnight on Saturday night, which could routinely last for hours. My parents would regularly bring us to this prayer meeting when we were even small children. We would have what we called conventions. Conventions were weeks during the year when people from other churches in our organization would come to the main church to listen to our pastor preach. Conventions were 5 days long and could last up to 12 hours a day. There really wasn't a time limit, as long as the Spirit was leading the pastor to continue. We even had to discuss potential relationships with pastors in order to get God's approval. There are a lot of things I could point to, but what got me out was when I took a long look at how the pastor was treated and how my brother was treated in that community. Our pastor lived in a mansion. This was explained away by the fact that her husband, who, incidentally, never attended church, was wealthy. Despite the wealth, people from the church were at her constant beck and call to do the yard work and maintain the house. People weren't paid for their work. The most compensation people received was the occasional opportunity to sit and speak with the pastor. By the reactions of the people who got the privilege to speak with the pastor, you would have thought they had been paid in gold. Our pastor's word was law. She had written over 50 books on varying biblical topics and people treated them like they were extensions of the Bible. We even had a Bible quiz curriculum built on what she wrote, and we spent days memorizing as much of it as we could. My brother was the nail in the coffin for me. Growing up, I really looked up to him. He's insanely intelligent and was extremely social. As an average introvert, there was a lot about my brother that I even envied. There was one big problem with my brother. He has the misfortune of being gay. He would never admit it to anyone, but I've spent my whole life watching him struggle with something he has been taught and believes is wrong. I firmly believe that the constant anxiety directly contributed to his development of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. When he first started having mental health issues, medications were always coupled with scripture and prayer. When he started hearing voices, he would spend days praying because everything he had been taught told him that he was battling real demons. He's now in his 30s and still lives in a toxic situation with my parents. All I can say is that I wish I had pursued my skepticism earlier. I've been out for a while now and do what I can to help my family, but it's hard. It's difficult shaking 16 years of indoctrination. As far away as I'm from it, I'm still discovering ways it's impacted my perception of the world every day. I was not born into, but raised in the mainstream Mormon church, which I consider to be a cult, because of the high control tactics. See also Steve Hassan's work on cults. So when I was about 15, I was sexually abused by my 30-year-old stepbrother for an entire summer. When that news became public within the family, really long story short, the local church leaders saw fit to punish me for being a filthy hoe. Not sure. There was a bit of public shunning where I wasn't allowed to participate in certain things, and although nobody came out and painted a big scarlet letter A on my chest, everyone knows the reason why someone isn't allowed to do those certain things, so it was no secret. I was supposed to be on probation for 6 months, and when that term ended, I went to the bishop to ask how I would be reinstated. And that motherfucker said this: well, Dogzillus_mom, I think you still have some repenting to do. You haven't forgiven yourself yet. I just stared at him, wondering what the fuck did I do that I'm supposed to forgive myself for. Blink blink. Then I said, for what? And then he stared at me and just walked away. In that moment, I knew that everything I had been taught in that church was complete bullshit and all the promises were utter lies. If you live right, you're rewarded. If you sin, you're punished. I had done everything I was supposed to do and continued to even under punishment, yet I was still punished for something I had no control over whatsoever. It was another 3 to 4 months before he remembered to reinstate me, by which time I was literally just going through the motions, phoning it in. I knew I'd quit when I turned 18, but in the meantime, I still had to live with my parents, so I played along. Fast forward about 15 years or so when that poor girl Elizabeth Smart was kidnapped. Now my heart goes out to her, and she is a very strong woman, and I admire her for getting back to her life and recovering and dealing with the trauma. And she needed the church to help her do that. Good on her for all that. When she was found, and it became clear what had happened to her, I wondered to myself if her bishop was going to punish her too, because these bishops are supposed to pray about how to handle these situations and receive revelation from God about what's up. So my bishop's decision was supposed to have been divinely inspired, and I sat there on my couch, and listened to her bishop say, right on CNN in front of God and everybody, that Elizabeth was still pure in the eyes of God. So now God is really inconsistent about how rap victims are to be handled. Some of us are to blame for our own raps and some of us are still pure in the eyes of God. That was the second oh shit moment, and I pretty much resigned from the church right then, even though I stopped attending and participating when I turned 18. Sorry to offend any active Mormons who may be reading this, but that was my experience and there is nothing anyone could say or do that would convince me that the current mainstream Mormon church is much different from the polygamous offshoots, RLDS, FLDS, Wethavao. They're all the same cult, they use the same scriptures as canon, and they both hate women. Mine was a slow burn that just added up over the years. The pastor was obsessed with modesty and would preach on it constantly. A few notable examples: I once wore a new pair of jeans to a teen event that he claimed were appallingly tight. He made me and my mom go to a thrift store to buy looser ones. The humiliating part was that I was expected to carpool with all my friends to the event, so they were waiting for me in the parking lot, both girls and boys, as I sobbed in embarrassment and tried to find some looser jeans. He and his wife lit into my best friend's parents for allowing her to wear red high heels with blue jeans. Considering there were many of these weird rebukes about this friend in particular, I have a feeling he actually had a perverse attraction to her and was trying to project the blame on her appearance/behavior. She was in high school at the time. I was hanging out with my friends out in the field behind the church and was flopped out on the grass, fully clothed, not behaving suggestively at all. He told my parents that I should never lie flat on the ground if any males are present, because they will be instantly urged to get on top of me. He would make sermon illustrations about how he saw women in public ogling him and how sinful that was. Of course, that didn't stop him from going jogging shirtless multiple times a week. Even after all his obsession with sexual sin, it turned out that he was fully aware of sexual abuse going on in a church family and had not notified authorities. In case you are not aware, pastors are mandatory reporters. I still don't know how he got away with that. I left when I got married and decided that I would never subject my future kids to the emotional distress I went through. This is not even the tip of the iceberg with this church. They ended up being in the local news for suing a former congregant over a bad Google review. After I left, they tried to claim I had joined a prostitution ring. I have so many weird stories. Sometimes I can't believe I didn't see through the crap long before I did. Thankfully, I'm long out of there and seeing life much more clearly. And here's something that I wish I had known before that might help anyone reading this who is in some kind of cult. Leaving a cult does not mean you have to abandon your faith. My relationship with God has flourished now that the Bible is my guide and isn't just being used by a narcissist to control me. Not a cult, but more of a really strict religious upbringing. Also not really a very specific moment, just tons of moments in general. Back in the time, Pokemon cards were collected by pretty much everyone. The Christian school and the church weren't too sure what to do about it yet. At some point they decided that many of the Pokemon cards represented demons and the devil. Long story short, I had to throw away my entire collection, which was considerable at the time. Not being allowed to have TV or open internet. All it was a gateway to worldly things that will corrupt us. Best part is, quite a few families did have TVs, they just hid it in the attic or a closet. On Sunday, I wasn't allowed to leave the backyard. Our backyard looked over a sort of large square. My 3 best friends were not Christian. We were very much into soccer at the time. All I remember is me watching through the bars of our backyard fence and see how my friends were playing soccer. I was never allowed to join. The incredible emphasis on going to hell if you sin. Not wearing the correct clothing? That's a sin. Do you want to go to hell? Thinking the wrong things? Sin. Pretty much everything that wasn't praying or reading a Bible felt like a sin. I hated going to church. It was 90 minutes, usually 105 even, of sitting, not moving and listening to the most boring story ever. Going through all the motions and all that. Singing monotone and slow. For me, as a very energetic and sporty kid, this was pure agony. I was forced to go to church 2 times every Sunday and Sunday school for another 60 minutes. Try explaining to any of them that the Bible has mistakes in it. There are small number discrepancies that are very easy to prove. Person A in the Bible says 3.000 chariots and person B, talking about the exact same event, says 13.000 chariots. That is a discrepancy, right? Well, they believe the Bible has been written by God himself, so it is impossible to contain a mistake. It is 100% correct. They will find a way to correct such a discrepancy. I tried it once on a birthday. I should note I still believe in the Bible, but changed my views drastically. But I'm not a fool and I understand there are mistakes and I understand evolution. Well, I tried discussing this. I came up with an example of mistake. He said he didn't believe me, so I told him I'd show him. I googled some website, showed him the example, told him to grab a Bible and check. Well, he responded with, "You are just looking something up on Google, that doesn't count." Also got pretty much ridiculed after that point. There is a lot more, but these sort of really stand out to me. I should also add that despite this, I love my parents very much, and they raised me incredibly well. Besides the whole Christianity, they were amazing parents. I also do appreciate the norms and values they, and even the church, have taught me. They went a little overboard, but they were good people. It's not a cult moment, but I left my family's church after this incident. My dad told me to take a year of Bible college, or he'd stop paying for the rest of my education. I figured it was a small sacrifice, so I went for it. A week before the semester began, I was brought up in front of the church, alongside a girl who was joining AmeriCorps, ostensibly for the church, to pray their blessings upon us. What we got instead was a prophet who had no message from God, just a long recap of her qualifications as a prophet. Not only would she not shut up about how she had predicted this or that, she refused to let me step down from the pulpit area until she had heard me proclaim that I was going to become a pastor like my father. Here's where it got worse. I was going to Bible college for a year. The girl who was going into AmeriCorps to deal with disaster relief and humanitarian aid was summarily ignored by the wannabe prophet. Despite the fact that her good works and deeds would far outshine mine, I was the focus of the prophet's words. I found out later that both my dad and the senior pastor were about to step in to stop her, but that's when she started speaking in tongues. I went through the year of Bible college, but only went back to that church once. I realized that a lot of the older parishioners were just like that woman, confusing their own lack of a filter for a divine message. I wasn't in a cult, but my parents forced me to go to Jesus camp with the other kids at our Church of Young Earth Creationism. The stuff I saw there, and kids I met, was definitely my first experience with people in cults. As a kid I had this understanding that some of the kids at church events were over the edge and the world saw their actions as undesirable, and every once in a while I would do a mental check. Okay, am I getting weird? Is this undesirable? A 6 to 12-year-old should not have to do a reality check. I remember this one time at Jesus camp. The indoctrination propaganda was rolling hard that day. It was like 10 hours of synagogue in the morning to prep our little minds for a night of creepy events. Lots of God loves you, and you should love him. This is how raise your hands up and speak with him stuff. So I'm disconnected at this point. I'm people watching, kids breaking down and crying over love for God, camp counselors driving it home that Jesus was killed brutally for us. I was expecting Kool-Aid to be passed out at any time. Then they lead us into a dark forest where a very dark and bloody crucifixion reenactment was put on for us. I remember thinking, this sucks. Everyone is in a state of trance. This is weird. Why would you kill a man like this? If I were there I would have stopped it. At that point the tension was so thick in the air I felt I had to cut it with a knife. I blurted out during the reenactment and was removed. I never asked for this. I never had anything to do with this man's death. You can't blame me for my ancestors taking slaves, so why would this affect me? My OC moment was that these kids opened themselves up to a belief. A few kind people said some soft words, then showed them a human sacrifice to get the emotions flowing, and bam, they were indoctrinated for a lifetime. That's all it took. On mobile, so formatting could be weird. Sorry this is long, but I left a fanatical religious sect 5 years ago, and I'm still dealing with the trauma. I was brought up in the Hardline Church of Christ, a religious sect which, by other Christian denominations and previous members, is often considered a spiritually abusive church cult-like tendencies within their more fundamentalist churches. A couple of important things to note. This is not the International COSI, which is a particularly dangerous pseudo-Christian cult. Also, some churches of Christ are really great and aren't cult-like at all. There are several different kinds of these churches, and the one I refer to in the post is generally called Hardline COSI, the most fundamentalist of them all. In a nutshell, the beliefs you need to know in the Hardline COSI sect for this post. Strictly literal interpretation of the Bible. Sexist. Very sexist. Women are seen as subordinate to men in essentially every way, cannot hold any leadership position, and cannot speak or pray in worship services. Except for sexual immorality, they don't recognize divorce for any reason, including domestic abuse. Musical instruments are strictly forbidden. Many hardline COSIs do not even have classrooms, parking lots, kitchens or offices. The one I grew up in did have a kitchen, a few classrooms, and a parking lot, but their beliefs were definitely hardline. Worst of all, they do not believe that anyone else except for the churches of Christ are going to heaven. This is for several reasons I won't go into detail for unless you'd like, but they literally call themselves the one true church and the Lord's church. Everything else is false doctrine of man or a man-made denomination. Each congregation is autonomous, led by male elders and deacons whose leadership is often taken way too far, to the point of cultish rulership. Do not celebrate the religious aspect of any liturgical holiday, including Easter and Christmas. I'm a woman and a violinist by profession, so obviously life was hell for me in this church. My sheet moments are as follows. They just added up until I couldn't take it anymore. Was hushed by a man in a Bible class as you would shush a toddler, just for asking a question. Was at a ladies' day and a man entered the building who apparently didn't get the memo. We had to stop what we were doing until he left, so we wouldn't usurp authority. When I was around 12, had to leave my violin in a hot car during church services because the elder leadership didn't want Pastor B to see me even bringing my violin into church, which, to them, in their own words that day, would have been the appearance of evil. Asked to play a COSI wedding gig at another church, but instruments weren't allowed on the church grounds. They said they would set us up in a tent across from the property and funnel the sound into the church through speakers. I declined the gig. Watched a poor girl get baptized 3 times in freezing water because her knee kept coming up, which she later said was a reaction to the cold water. Her preacher kept yelling again, "We don't take chances with God," until her entire body went under. She cried afterwards. When I left the COSI, I lost literally all of my childhood friends. It was then I truly knew that they were trouble. Thankfully my family left with me, so I didn't lose them, but I had to start my social and spiritual life basically all over at age 18. A wonderful newly married couple were publicly disfellowshipped by the elders in humiliating fashion because it was discovered that the husband had previously been married. Emotion, which they considered to include raising hands or kneeling to pray in church, was forbidden and touted as disobedience to God. I have many more, but those are the worst. Point: I'm a worship leader and musician in the Methodist Church now. For a false doctrine of man, lol, they're pretty amazing. The trauma is real, but my spiritual life is getting better and better, and I'm finally where I can use my talents in wonderful ways, y'all. Fundamentalism is real, and it's scary. I wish it wasn't so overlooked. It's one of the most backwards, sexist, dangerous ideologies of today. They've placed a horrible name on all Christians. Just know not all Christians are like this. Edit always typus. I was a JW when I was in grade 3 to grade 9. My mom had been disfellowed because, before I was born, the elder women came to the house and told dad he was a bad father and husband and leave my mom and my brother to go on a mission and become a better man. When my mom heard that, she told him to get back, quote, "those faking beaches out of her house, and no one speaks to her husband that way." So that was the end of that. They were all baptized and went door knocking. When I was in grade 3, my dad asked me if I wanted to be a JW, and I asked him what it was. He explained it, and, being a daddy's girl, I agreed. Around the ages of 9 to 11 I started to see things I didn't really like. The sisters telling me my brother was a sinner and going to hell and lots of judgment. I think the real turning points for me were two moments. Firstly, I was sitting at a service with the sisters. I think it might have been a memorial, and a man drank wine and ate bread. I asked the sisters why he was doing it and no one else was, and they said it was because he knew he was one of the 144,000 that will go to heaven. I asked them how he knew, and they said that God told him. I responded with but how do you know it's true? I could say that I was one of the chosen and drink the wine and eat the bread and you wouldn't have any way of knowing it wasn't true. They didn't like that, and I sensed the judgment, defensiveness, and annoyance at me asking questions. This triggered an immediate distrust and I started asking many more questions. Secondly, a girl in my church was raped, got pregnant, and had an abortion. The church told her family to turn their backs on her and never have anything to do with her again because of the abortion. I couldn't understand that kind of cold, psychotic heartlessness. I left when I was 11 or 12. I spent years getting over guilt, especially sexual guilt, and I still have trouble with the fact that my father still sees it as the one true faith. I've learned, after many arguments, to not talk religion with him. But he quite consistently tells me that woman is second to man, that a woman's place is behind man, that I have allowed the devil to guide me away, and I will be judged by God for it. Strangely enough, he doesn't say the last one in a menacing or angry way. It's more that he's disappointed. Our relationship gets strained at times because of this stuff, but we still get along quite well for the most part. We just try not to talk about any of it with each other, because I don't believe in standardized religion and he does, and we can't change each other. I've just never been able to figure out how such an intelligent and rational man can believe in that stuff. He told me the other day that he doesn't believe in dinosaurs and I tried talking to him about how illogical that was, but ended up having to bite my tongue, leave it, and walk away. Well, that's my story, lol. I was born into a cult known only as a fellowship in 1975. For the first 7 years of my life, I grew up amid this massively perverted version of Christianity. My parents lived in a large house in Oxford in the UK, owned by the leader, who for the purposes of this forum, I will call Bob, which we shared with various other cult members. Some seriously crazy stuff went on, and Bob exerted control over my parents in increasingly alarming ways. What I most resented is the way he banned children from being allowed toys because he insisted parents buy presents only from his sports shop, having no interest in football, cricket, etc. That was immensely frustrating. I was told the toys I wanted, toy tractors and farm machinery mostly, were evil. I could not understand how or why that could possibly be the case. Bob's control of the fellowship was absolute. We were utterly isolated, except we had to go to school, by law. If relatives weren't in the fellowship, we weren't allowed to see them. I didn't even know what uncles, aunts, cousins, grandparents were, until later. I was also never allowed on school trips, or allowed to visit zoos, or attend firework displays. Television was banned, and I didn't even know what a cinema was. When I was 7, the fellowship collapsed after Bob's sudden death. It then transpired that he'd been sleeping with various women in the congregation, ripping off loads of people, etc. When I tell people this story, they can't understand how my parents and everyone else caught up in it could have been deceived, but it is impossible for those who were outside to understand the nature of deception, or how vulnerable my parents and others were to it. Anyway, all of this, and some of the oppressive experience I had in a group of churches my parents were in afterwards, inspired a novel I wrote entitled Children of the Folded Valley. It was deeply cathartic to write, and is my most successful book to date. It has 83 mostly positive reviews on Amazon's UK site, and about 17 on the US Amazon site. Anyone who has been in a cult will find it interesting, I have no doubt. I was raised in a Jehovah's Witnesses household, and at age 17 I gradually started to leave. I've seen comments here about how they're a cult, and wanted to share my experience. Were my parents angry when I left? At first they're obviously disappointed, because they raised me in a religion, and in a certain lifestyle, and I was throwing it away, but after that we sat, and they asked about why I left. I gave my reasons and they are understanding. My father admitted that there's no religion with undeniable proof about their preachings, and that it is about whether you put faith into it or not. They said that, while they would like me to be a part of it, they wouldn't like for me to force myself into something I'm not comfortable with, that they would always love me no matter if I was a Jehovah's Witness or not and only expected of me to be a good person. Was it detrimental to my social life? In a way yes, but not much. I wasn't allowed to go to clubs, nightclubs, like the ones you go to dance and drink. As a teen and most birthday parties, I did attend some, because they didn't want to deprive me from going to at least one, and I had one myself. But I was encouraged to make friends at school, at the club, sports, everywhere. How did my parents react when they caught me watching porn? They talked with me about it, about how porn doesn't reflect sexual relationships in real life, and they told me it would be much more enjoyable to actually discover how it works with another person, and not by watching people faking in a screen. They didn't take my phone away or anything. They told me that they trusted me with making the best decision myself. How did the rest of the community reacted? I sometimes find them at the supermarket and they always say hi and ask how are things going. I'm not shunned or anything. Like in every group there's nice people, arrogant people, assholes. Also, although some of the beliefs might seem hilarious, and they do have that stance that we got it right and the rest of the religions didn't, they also talked a lot about being a good persons and cultivating good qualities, being respectful of other, etc. I also read a lot of comments about Mormons, and though I don't know much about them, there was a Mormon kid in high school and him and his brother were nice guys. Not as seen those in r/nase guys, but nice people that seemed normal enough like everybody else. What I'm trying to say is, every religion has hardcore fanatics, assholes, etc. But they are not representative of the whole group. I'm sure for every Catholic priest that sexually assaulted a minor, there's one that helped someone get out of alcoholism, drug abuse or a violent partner. Religion isn't black or white, it's gray like everything, because it's formed by human beings. They do have their negative side, but they also have their good side and many people is affected in a positive manner by them. I'm sure many people here had a negative experience with JW, Mormons or other religious group. But there's a difference between them and cults, and I think it's good to think things with objectivity. I wasn't born into a cult. My mom joined when I was 4 or 5. They made us sell all of our worldly belongings, car, TV, clothes, books etc. and move to Georgia so they could spread the word. I always knew that something was up with this group of people that believed that suffering brought you closer to God. But my what the fuck moment really happened was when I about 7 and had gotten really sick. I had been throwing up everything I ate/drank for about 5 days or so. I had a fever that wouldn't go below 102 degrees F, no matter how many ice baths I took. Instead of taking me to the we walked to church, about 2 miles, because we couldn't have cars. I remember thinking that I wasn't going to make it as I struggled to walk up the Georgia hills. When we got to the church, instead of taking to me the few members began praying and speaking in tongues over me. I was still very sick at the end of services and was scolded by the pastor, who had declared that she was a prophetess and healer, for not having faith in God and having faith in man, aka doctors. From the moment my mother joined the cult, I was skeptical, but that night really cemented their mental derangement in my mind. From that point on, everything I did was done with the goal of getting away from them all. My stepsister ran away in the middle of the night soon after that point. My mother left the cult when I was preteen, but still was hyper religious, dragging us around to countless churches and forcing us to pray for hours on end. I got an academic scholarship and left when I was 17 and have never looked back. Slightly different here, but qualifies as basically a cult point. I was raised in a super strict Christian family, homeschooled too, lived in the country, experienced every type of abuse there is, was not allowed any social interaction. Neighbors are out to get us. The times we would go to the store I had to literally stay by one parent's side even as a teen. No one wants to talk to you was also said. Was never left alone at home. I didn't realize how non-normal my family was because I had no outside comparison. So I felt that I somehow deserved it and that I was bad. Eventually I acquired an internet connection and slowly started seeing how not normal my family was. Eventually I ran a background check on my parents and it informed me about a brother I didn't know I had. I knew the name, but he left when I was young and they always hated on him and made us scared of him. I thought he was just some person that screwed them. Slow car drives by. It's probably him scouting, like he was going to kill us all or something. See a hunter walking around with a gun. Is that him? No, he was my brother who left home as a legal adult. He got sick of the control and isolation and said some things they deserved to hear. After he left they made us siblings, including little me, hate him. I don't remember that, but my sister told me. I guess in my young mind the easiest solution was lose the connection, that he was family. Eventually CPS, I fucking hate you, you cowardly pieces of shit. You never even talked to us kids away from the parents. You never went inside. You were pussies. Because of lawyer threats, got involved because he called them. They turned up their hatred for him and basically classified him as an enemy of the family. Turns out he's a good guy. But in that moment I was like, what? Fuck. Wow. It was a turning point that led to me realizing how faked up my family is and that my parents are terrible people. I probably sat there staring at the background check for several minutes as a few memories started to come back. After getting the info from my sister I was so angry I wanted to beat them both up. Fortunately an online friend got me to consider leaving as an alternative option. And I did. Not a true cult, but still weird as f. My parents were not raised religious. My early childhood had no religion. One day when I was 9 my dad woke up, quite literally, and had found Jesus. From that moment on, he waded further and further off the deep end. He was an entomologist, quite capable of critical thinking, had discovered new insects and shit. But slowly, the critical thinking stopped, and my dad just became, well, I think he kind of equates himself to God or something. We never went to an actual church. Sunday consisted of listening to a preacher on the radio and or watching a Billy Graham sermon. Then my dad would follow up with his own sermon, and we would pray and cheat. Punishments frequently involved memorizing, writing, reciting Bible verses, or spankings with various instruments, or simply standing silently facing a corner. My dad is an expert cherry picker, finding verses to suit his agenda and mince it. Now it's gotten so bad that my parents think that if Hillary had become president, that the floodgates would be open for Muslims to come into the US and slaughter Christians. They think Trump is the answer to the moral sinkhole that our godless country has become. I moved across the country to get away from them over 8 years ago, but I cut off all communication 1.5 years ago. Through lots of therapy I've come to learn that my dad is a narcissist who just used religion to control his family. He's also a raging misogynist. etc. I've had a few oh shit moments over the years. Once I went to college and learned that most people do in fact attend an actual church service. Once I started really listening to all the racist hate my parents spewed while claiming to be super Christian. My biggest oh shit moment came after Trump was elected and I saw just how many people shared his creepy mindset and how none of them are actually real Christians. They are just all piece of shit people. My first oh shit moment happened when I was very young, in a dream. I dreamt about seeing all the people I knew, and some I didn't recognize at the time, all in this big room type area. We were all kind of like babies, but we could talk with each other. Some babies were crying and holding on to their loved ones, saying I'll see you soon, and others crying because they knew it would be years before they met again. We could watch each other on a screen and see what each other looked like born. When I went down my tunnel/elevator thing, I woke up. It felt so real, and I want to say I was around 5 or 6 when I had this dream. And I'm 21 now. My second oh shit moment was when I started learning about my mom and other things. Realized, how could there be a God if he let kids go through abuse, drug addicted parents, and feel the pain I felt for a long time. My grandparents adopted me around 7, and at 8 I asked my father and stepmother questions. They answered only exactly what I asked, and not more or less. I got the gist from that. Then it all hit. I decided myself How could there be an almighty God that loved all his children and let rap, abuse, murder, and all the other things happen to his children? That's when I figured out that every person has their own will, not some plan that was made up. You can literally feel yourself make a choice in your head. No one else makes that choice for you. I'll still sit with my family when they pray if they want me to. But I made myself clear around 13 or 14 that I do not believe in any religion. I believe one day I'll be reconnected with my sister who passed and every friend I'd lost, but not in a place above the clouds. Not a cult per se, but I was raised by Catholic parents in an all-Catholic family and went to a private Catholic school for 9 years. As a little kid I was just very confused by a lot of things about my religion, and when I or any of my classmates asked what I believed to be valid questions, they were shot down or not answered at all. I would try and pray to God, but I never felt like anyone was listening. I had no faith. I would pray for things like the health of a family member, only for them to die. Was God listening, or was he even there? In the 2008 election, I realized for the first time that Catholicism forbid homosexuality, and I thought this to be so confusing, even as a child, because gay people are people, and God created people in his image, so what's wrong with them? In the 5th grade we were taught for the first time the basic stuff about other major world religions. Saw all these wonderful photos of religious monuments and buildings, and learned that all religions pretty much had the same golden rule, but then told that anyone who didn't believe in the same God as me was wrong, and damn to hell who am I to say whose God is wrong. This really sticks out to me as my oh shit moment. More and more silent speculation on my part for the rest of my Catholic school days. Then I went to public high school. Very eye-opening. My parents still forced me to go through confirmation, which was absolute hell. Confirmation ironically confirmed how much I didn't believe in the faith I'd been raised in. On this one retreat we had, there was a speaker who gave the most bullshit talk I'd ever heard. I was afraid to admit it openly to myself before then, but after hearing that talk, I recognized myself as atheist. It was hard to admit that the thing I'd been raised to believe and taught so much about was just completely wrong, especially when my whole family would not agree with me at all and would probably distance themselves from me. I still have not openly told my parents or other relatives that I'm an atheist. I don't want to fight with them, and that's all that will lead to. Obligatory. Not really a cult, but felt like it. I guess most hardcore religious places do though, don't they? Growing up I was your stand-up perfect Catholic, attended Sunday, Saturday, and Friday church services, Sunday school, helped out in some services as an altar server, and attended a private Catholic school. The whole package. But for some reason in my spare time, outside of religious study and services, and helping out at home, I spent my time either looking at the state of nature and how things work. Now that I put it to the proverbial paper, it was really the start of my love of philosophy and physics. Also we were allowed to watch Stephen Hawking, but were always taught all he helped us with was understanding what God had given us and how he was going to be severely punished in hell in excruciating detail, which hurt as he was and became the reason for my love of physics. His death hurt me more than when we put down our dog. Anyway, one fateful day in year 6 in religion class at school, the teacher said something that seemed a bit off, so I questioned it and proposed an alternate, more accurate, reason for what she was explaining. The class was shocked, and the teacher in disbelief, and couldn't answer the question. I was sent out of class and then taken to the priest who, with only the teacher as witness, attempted to remove the hold of Satan over me, which consisted of multiple strikes to my person and showering me. Don't worry, I had clothes on still, thankfully, in holy water. When my mother found out what had happened, she was seemingly unfazed. That was my tipping point. I was done with all that shit. This was my oh shit moment, although things that had perturbed me on the topic had risen up multiple times throughout schooling. I got my brothers out of there as soon as I could. Thankfully we had some financial problems and we had to move state, so they ended up in a normal school and were, ironically, saved. I ended up taking longer on some views, but my adamant study of physics, and, once I found philosophy, I was able to finally break my beliefs and now live quite comfortably studying astrophysics and philosophy at uni, loving the moments I encounter fundamentalists or uber religious people and them damning me to hell. Not born into one, but joined on my own in my teen years. Left at 21. What got me to leave? Though the family commune was super close and supportive for the first year I stayed with them, the first months into the second year, everyone became very cold towards each other and myself. Noon told me what was to come, since I was still a youth, and not an adult, so couldn't go to the adult meetings. So anyways, I was uncomfortable with how I was living. There was the top family, a guy with 4 wives living with him, along with their 12 to 20 kids. Number fluctuated a lot, and 2 to 3 on the way every year, and other smaller families, and separated women and men. I had to share a room with 1 wife and 3 kids, and pay rent for it. The head guy would take my school refund checks every semester as a donation to the family for adopting me, I guess, but not let me buy myself any shoes or books. They wouldn't let me drive or take public transit alone, so would have to shuttle me to and from places every day. The wives would huff and puff every time I called home needing a ride from school. They would huff and puff when I asked for dinner and complain of eating too much when it was only salads. We were vegan. The body fat shaming was a problem as well. They took my cell phone, which my BO dad, not in the community, would pay for to keep up with me. They would give my phone to a wife or daughter my age to use for weeks at a time. My dad complained. At the end, it was announced 3 of the wives were pregnant, and I felt I was taking up space. Folks in the community that were my friends kept hinting at something big about to happen to leadership, but wouldn't tell me anything else. I was uncomfortable enough to call my dad and ask him to pick me up. I announced it to the family to their dismay, but their actions said the opposite. One wife helped me pack by throwing all my stuff outside before my dad showed up. After I finally arrived home with my real family, I called to check in, and they dropped the bombshell 1 call at a time. My spiritual father was sleeping with everybody. Everybody's wife, daughter married a 16-year-old girl, impregnated another 15-year-old out of state, slept with his best friend's wife in a 3-some with her daughter, while on family vacation. Orgies, you name it. Not only home, but most of the men in the community were dogs apparently. I got calls from friends needing to get tested and divorced. We were one of those groups that thought vegetarianism is the best medicine for everything. Not against syphilis, I suppose. In a hoe. I got out of that mess totally unaware my feelings were hurt, since I thought that was the truth. But time heals kinda. I was technically born into a cult, but I barely remember it. It was a fundamentalist Christian cult. My parents grew up in it, in different states, but they went to a college owned by the cult and met there. Got married 6 months after meeting. They are still married 30 years later. My grandfather on my dad's side worked for the cult leader. My grandfather on my mom's side was banned from the church when my mom was young because he wanted to vote in elections. Her mom and the kids kept going. The rules of the church were similar to Mormons, but it wasn't Mormon. They didn't celebrate holidays except for Old Testament holidays like the Feast of the Tabernacles. That was a big one for them. No birthdays. No going out on the Sabbath. No marrying outside the church, but friends outside was okay. No piercings and makeup for my mom. Old-fashioned sexist family values. Weird beliefs about Jews. Absolutely hated Catholics for some reason. People who left after being baptized were disowned. No participating in politics. No eating unclean meats. Basically most of the Old Testament rules. The leader was accused of molesting his daughter. Nothing was ever proven, and my parents are adamant that it never happened, but they wouldn't really have known. Never asked my grandparents about it. My grandfather had a portrait of this guy in his living room. He really looked up to him. The leader had died by the time I was born, and one of his kids took over. It apparently became a little more chill when that happened. Less of a cult, and more of just an old-fashioned values church. I remember going to the church when I was a kid. I was so young, so it was basically just like daycare. They didn't teach me anything, it was mostly arts and crafts. The people were normal and friendly. I occasionally went to church with my dad's parents growing up. It was boring, and my grandma would give me paper to draw on, and I'd do that the whole time. My parents decided to leave when we were young because they wanted us to grow up celebrating holidays and having a more normal life. They are still Christian. We started going to a mainstream non-denominational Christian church. My dad's parents stayed in the church and they were required to disown my parents, not the grandkids though, because they had been baptized in the church and then left. My grandmother never really committed to the disowning thing and continued to talk to my dad and her daughter who was also disowned. My grandfather went back and forth on it. He really believed in the church teachings, but he wasn't a bad person. He loved his grandkids, and he never tried to push any beliefs on us. I know he loved his kids too, but he believed that, because my dad and his sister had left the church they would go to hell, and have no second chance, and I think that was hard for him to reconcile. My dad's brother was an atheist who never was baptized in the church, so he was not disowned, because he would still have a second chance. My mom's family left the church after the leader died. One of her brothers joined a weird different cult, and married a crazy lady, and we don't really hear from him. All her other siblings, she has 8, are normal. All of them are Christian, but the more standard variety now. A good friend told me this story about how his mom escaped a cult in the 70s. He told me that his mom was dragged along with his uncle by their mother into a cult he described as pagan Satanism. His grandfather died previously, and her new boyfriend talked them into moving. He described it as the typical 70s dark goat sacrifice cult. It was based in Texas and the leader was from Mexico illegally. As per the cliche, it was very male-centric and the girls had no rights. The leaders would order them to do all sorts of things from cleaning to performing sexual acts during rituals. They would also beat anyone who tried to argue. He told me that at first his grandma seemed to be completely out of it. Drugs were used often, and the leaders used LSD and other things to help keep the order. Often giving good worshippers drugs, while bad ones would go without. One day his mother at age 11, mind you, was brutally raped by some cokehead and cried to her mother about wanting to die. This snapped her out of it enough to want to leave. So with her daughter and son, who was 7 at the time, made an escape. The problem was that the building they were in was an old apartment complex that the owners built a wrought iron fence around. So to escape they snuck down to the basement and lifted the large drainage cover from the old sewer. They crawled the equivalent of half a city block through sludge until they got to a point they could go no further. They spent around half the night waiting until daybreak, until they were able to call to some people on the street above. The fire department were called and pulled them out. His grandmother wouldn't tell anyone what happened or how they ended up in the sewer. Instead they fled, fearing the wrath of the cult they just escaped from. They moved back to their hometown, and years later moved again across country, where his mother finished high school and eventually started a family. He told me that the cult didn't last but a few years, but his mom could imagine all the lives it ruined up till that point. He also told me he could never do the story real justice because his mother was a lot better at the details. His mom is a nice, humble person, and I cringe at the thought of what happened to her when she was a kid. There was this guy my mom and stepdad would listen to every day on shortwave radio called RG Stare. I was like 7 when they took me and my siblings out of school to homeschool us because of satanic influence of the teachers in public school. I put homeschool in quotes because there was no education at all, no reading, writing, no math, just Bible study, fire, and brimstone. This guy they listened to would say things like, "We are in the last days, the world is about to end." If it didn't end, he would curse God to his face. He had a strange way of talking that my parents loved. They loved that he spoke the hard truth. I just thought he was rude. He had a massive tent meeting in Walterboro, South Carolina, and my family drove down with some of their fellow worshippers and camped up for a week. When I saw the prophet, my 9-year-old self couldn't help but to think, all of these people are here to see this shrimpy old man sit in a rocking chair on a stage and talk shit. He was pathetic, screaming about the sins of women, how deceitful we all were, and how the men needed to keep a close eye and a firm grip to keep us pregnant, or when the Russians and Chinese invade us, they'll take us for their wives, but if we are fat with child, well. I snapped into reality when one man, in the front row, leaned over and whispered something to his wife while the preacher was on one of his hour-long rants. The old man hopped up off of his rocking chair, snatched off his belt, and started beating a grown-ass man for insolence and disrespect while the prophet spoke. The guy being beaten put his hands up in the air like he was receiving a blessing. I thought to myself, oh nope, this ain't right. There was also a trailer that select young women were staged for selection, basically for the parents of young men to go in and pick out a wife for their sons. The parents of the girls didn't get a say after they consented to the process and could vouch for the girls' ability to bear children. They'd started their periods and serve their husbands, cook and clean, I guess. I realized at 9 years old this was all crazy. I wanted no parts. And that I didn't even believe in God. There were way too many interpretations of what this deity wanted and expected. And I couldn't even see or hear him. And if he existed, it was his fault mom took my education and my friends away. The prophet ended up arrested for touching underage women. He'd even instructed one how to do a bathtub abortion when she became pregnant with his child. I still can't believe this is real life, or how the hell I turned out semi-normal. My 3 daughters don't know their grandparents, and they can't understand why I do much of what I do. When they get older I'll tell them for sure. It was no one thing. I had access to a library as far back as I can remember and learned to read pre-K, got to know how to read the Bible. That's what saved me. My babysitter was the library, and I read endlessly. I read things that people of authority in my life had never heard or thought of to even know to forbid from me. And when those people started saying things that contradicted what I read, I presumed that I would be able to reconcile things as I grew older. Then the internet arrived. I had access to BSS through the library. A bit later, my own house, as I figured out how to set up connections from my own home. My views expanded in ways that the cult couldn't contain. There just wasn't enough room for the knowledge I had. And I was a kid. That alone should illustrate how restrictive cults can be. That a child whose age is measured in a single digit can read their way above their knowledge ceiling. Then there was the web. Endless papers on science, on math, on every subject of biology and astrophysics and geology, and every bit of human knowledge that I had ever felt even a moment of curiosity about. And it was all kept up to date with modern news and discoveries, and somewhere in that time, it became clear in tiny steps that the cult wasn't the hidden bastion of truth is a sea of lies. The cult wasn't even a lie itself. It was just a series of stories and parables, similar to countless others that I had run across and read. It didn't help that the cult hated more or less everyone, including me, as I came to realize that I'm queer, so yeah, unrepentant nerd at this point. Also a furry, because why the hell not? Screw you cult. I can be both smarter and stupider than anything you have to offer, and have a lot more fun doing it. Mine was when they preached, when the boss enters a room you sit up straight and don't mess around. Why don't you do the same, or God? I don't know if what I grew up in is so much labeled as a cult. A lot of people in this church are really nice, and a lot mean well. What made me leave this church a few years ago was the way they preached and viewed life. For those who have been involved with Christianity, you know that a big part of Christianity is the relationship you have with God. It's something that draws people into Christianity. This church kept preaching about being good because God is watching, which is correct, he is watching. But I started to view God as someone I could only approach when I wasn't doing too many bad things. I hated going to church if I messed up in the prior week. But in reality, the best time to go to God is when you've messed up. I started to look at God almost like he was the boss and I was the employee. I felt like I couldn't have a relationship with him unless I was doing a lot of good things. The reason it seems so cult-like though is because of how legalistic they've become. It's at the point that many would say if you lied about hiding Jews from the Germans then you were sinning, because all lies are bad. It got to the point that you probably shouldn't raise your hands to God because it can be distracting to others. It got to the point that we shouldn't do things for God because we have love for him, but rather because we fear him. Everything started to become a ritual for me. I still have many friends with that church, and even my brother and his wife still go. But some churches under this denomination have very strict rules and even deny Christians from coming in until they are interviewed. It can be very exclusive. It's amazing to see how freeing it is to go to a church where you praise God not because you are commanded to, but because you want to. I feel sorry for my friends and brother because they haven't experienced that kind of freedom. Yes, it's not the crazy cult-like experiences others have where they are told to drink the juice or something, but it's a very destructive church. It's a church that separates themselves from the rest of the churches. It takes a really amazing story about Jesus and turns it from a relationship to a job. It really reminds me of the Pharisees in the Bible and their strict ways. Good intentions, but man did they miss it, when Jesus was right there. I've been seeing some similar to my experience, so I figured I'd just put it out there. I wasn't really born into a cult per se, but some of my family went to a sort of extremist Baptist church, the kind where people seem pretty normal when you meet them on the street, but then you learn about their practices behind the scenes, and it throws up a red flag point. So I used to go to summer Bible camp, and it was pretty mild when I went, from what I remember, which isn't much. But I heard sometime after I stopped going, think I stopped around 12 years of age, that they would put a shirt of shame on any young girls who they think dressed in a way that was too distracting for the guys. It was a huge neon yellow shirt, and they put it on if your neckline was too low, or if your shoulders showed point. My aunt and uncle were part of the church, and the pastor pulled my uncle aside one day and told him that my aunt was dressing too provocatively, apparently a lower neckline, but not the kind of low that I would call provocative. The pastor straight up told him to not let her wear things like that around others, and if she disobeyed he not so subtly hinted that he should beat her. They apparently had a fight after that, and eventually my aunt convinced my uncle to leave the church with her. The aunt and uncle in the previous paragraph had 3 kids, so my cousins, their eldest, a girl, had sex outside of marriage, at college, and got pregnant by accident. She wanted to get married before she had the child, so that they could grow up with married parents, but the church would not allow her to get married there unless she apologized for her sins in front of the entire congregation. She did it because a lot of the family went to the church, but I think that was an awful thing to make her do. Accidents happen all the time, and she wanted to make it right by getting married to the father and carrying the child to term, but they first had to ridicule her. Lastly, there was the case of my grandmother/grandfather. My grandparents actually lived close to the church, think it was like 1 to 2 mile away tops, and so they went to most, if not all, the events there. Well, my grandmother at some point got terminal cancer, and she was always on blood pressure medication. She had a metal valve for a long time, so she was in a great deal of pain, both due to the cancer and some huge blood clots forming. And my grandfather, with my mother in the room, mind you, this is my mother's mother, and he was a stepfather to her, that came later in life, was complaining about her not being able to feed him or clean, apparently ideologies he got from the very sexist church. My mom straightened him out by saying that he was acting like he only loved what she did for him, and not her as a person, and he spent the rest of his time with her, maybe a month, apologizing to her profusely and doting on her. It just disturbs me that the church would affect him so much that he'd tell a dying person how he was angry that she couldn't do anything for him. After she died, we held the funeral at that church, and when the members of the church shook hands with the family, they purposely skipped all of the women's hands, so my mother, my aunts, and me, and shook all of the men's hands. It was infuriating. I fortunately was only sent to that church when I was young, and my parents let me form my own beliefs. Think my O-sheet was when they made my cousin apologize. I was probably 10 years old, and I didn't understand why she couldn't just get married somewhere else. Now, I'm happily agnostic and avoid Baptist churches, if at all possible. Sorry it got so long, but it was nice to vent. Not a true cult, I think, just a very overwhelming Christian branch. I've had a few over the years, and I only made the decision to leave recently, once I felt the Lord supported my decision. A mindset I hate. Here are the things that really freak me out that makes me suspect it's cult-like. Also, I'm exhausted and on mobile. Forgive this train wreck. They teach through fear of hell. When I started having doubts, I realized this, because I started suffering extreme anxiety of going to hell. They like to tell you how bad it is, and how all non-Christians go there, and you will too if you don't get baptized, and be a good Christian. Sexism. I was told that I'm not supposed to be married, not God's plan for my radical view, that I didn't want to marry a man who viewed me as anything less than an equal. They lie about miracles to make you believe. They'll tell you about this amazing thing they saw, like a man's leg magically lengthening, a broken bone setting itself, etc. But when you ask for videos/pictures, since nothing usually goes undocumented in our mission trips, they'll swear up and down that the pictures and videos corrupted because God only wanted specific people to view it for some reason. People just love to claim to have otherworldly experiences, like speaking in tongues, visions, getting taken over by the spirit, terminal illnesses being removed by the spirit, usually told through visions, swearing to have the gift of prophecy, hearing God's voice, and once I heard about a little girl levitating through the power of God. If you aren't a specific personality type, extrovert, for example, you aren't a good Christian who isn't submitting to God's will. It is very exclusionist. If you're gay, or go against the grain in any way, you'll be socially exiled until you feel too uncomfortable to show up. This happened to me because I like to question things for curiosity. They've prayed for me to submit to God and trust blindly more times than I can count. I'm sure anyone who participated in the youth group at all are all the same exact religiously feverish personality. They just feel abnormal. It's unnatural to hear 13 to 14-year-olds talk about nothing but God outside of church, especially when they talk about becoming a Christian housewife as soon as they graduate high school and start looking for husband material by the time they hit puberty. The obsession with purity. They have you sign contracts to not have sex before marriage, demonizing born and masturbation from even before puberty, the whole you can never love fully if you lose your virginity to anyone but your husband thing, and urge rap victims to keep children that result from it, and ask God for forgiveness. Girls aren't even allowed to wear shorts above the knee, though it's not usually enforced, but other rules similarly ridiculous are, because they must keep their brothers in Christ pure. I could think of so much more, but I doubt the text wall would be a fun read. I'm finally breaking free of it and feel jaded, so it was nice to go on that rant. And edit, the most important part, that contributed to my leaving. All the worship they do, ever, makes me want to crawl out of my own skin, and I have to resist the urge to tear at my arms and face due to the extreme anxiousness it causes me. Nothing ever makes me that bad, not even the most average anxiety causing situations, and I don't have a history of self-harm. I have never felt the urge to hurt myself or sprint away as fast as I possibly can until I'm worshipping the Lord with them, which I think is the biggest red flag of all red flags. Not so much of a shocking or sad story. I won't give out many details because this church still exists to this day. No, it's not WBC. It started about 25 years ago. My grandparents teamed up with their siblings and a few close friends to start their own independent church. The entire congregation and member list were literally blood relatives or lifelong close friends and their families. It was a huge success. My mother was one of the core teachers in the church and she mostly taught the teenage sect. We left before I got old enough to attend her classes. I remember this really strong sense of family, like scarily strong. I remember all of the exorcisms to cure things like being gay or having depression or anger issues. We'd have like these weird exorcism parties. As a kid it was heavily drilled into me that literally everything was a sin. I'm a gay man, so it was terrifying. The main preacher, my great uncle, would do sermons heavily based on his interpretation of the Bible, which included women not being able to make their own decisions, gays deserving of being lynched in the streets, America being God's gift to white people, how everyone not in our church was likely going to rot in hell. They'd make us children perform in these really sadistic plays where us kids ages 11 to 14 would play people who got abortions or were gay or other sinners. And we'd die and everyone would cheer as Satan came out and dragged us into hell while we screamed. I remember that actually being fun at the time, even if it scared me and scarred me for life and still makes me ashamed of my sexuality. The biggest thing that happened was my mom was cornered and came on to by one of the male leaders. When she rejected him he used force and she had to fight him off of her. She went to the leaders and they took his side and told her she needs to know when it's her place to speak up. She quickly left and took me and my sister with her. We attended a normal Baptist church after that. A few years later my grandparents left, but my grandpa got sucked back in when my grandma died, and my sister got sucked back in too. Here's a story from someone who grew up not forced into religion. Probably too late now to be seen, but here we go, and wow am I glad my parents never even tried to push religion on me after reading these stories. When I was growing up I literally thought the Bible was another storybook bedtime book, though I didn't understand what the fuss was about, that they needed to go to a type of fan club book meeting every weekend. I found church dead boring, and did everything I could to not go. My parents aren't extremely religious, but they do believe. When I got older I realized that it's a bit bigger than just a fan club. I ended up asking my mom what religion I belonged to. She just said something about being a Methodist. I loved the sound of that word when I was little and thought of it as a title type thing. So my oh shit moment was when I realized that people actually believe what the Bible said. I was shook. It was the silliest thing I had heard. I was the kind of kid that never really believed in Santa or Tooth Fairy or anything. I always knew my parents adopted those roles and I assumed everyone else did. I kinda think I was that dickhead kid that accidentally told others what they believe is a lie. Never meant to be a sheethead, but I didn't understand why others didn't see Jesus, God, the Tooth Fairy, Hobgoblins and Dragons, Santa as one and the same. Just fun and cool bedtime stories. Apparently I even picked Jesus as a superhero in an imaginary game of villains and heroes or something. Jesus/God was up, he could do anything. They were one and the same to me back then. I'm not saying I knew everything, and I that was so smart I didn't fall for the tricks. I'm pretty dumb. But the way I was raised, I was able to think critically. The more I learnt about religion the more I began to actually hate it. I was so angry that so many people and so much money was spent on religions and churches and silly stories instead of space stuff and hospitals. I still hate religion, all of them, with a passion, because I think it's so archaic and does way more harm than good and delays our progress as a species like a ball and chain. I don't have any problems with any specific religions and or people. You can believe what you want, just don't shove it down my throat. I had multiple OC moments. It wasn't a cult, but the pastor in charge was trying to make a cult and ended up making one after my parents, and I left. My first OC moment was during a sermon. He told us to abandon all of family because we should love God more than our sin. I started bailing ship. My parents and I immediately had a discussion about how crazy the sermon was afterwards. My second OC moments was watching his wife slowly deteriorate. She used to be outgoing and willing to talk to people and ready to serve. She had 4 kids with him, the oldest being 7 when they left. She slowly started to become more withdrawn and more submissive. After church, she would usually come and shake everyone's hand and tell them to have a nice week. She stopped doing that. She just stood behind her husband, looking at the ground, sometimes holding one of her kids, usually not. Shortly after, due to unrelated things, I became an atheist. I went to church less frequently, but my parents came home talking about how strange the sermon was, and I had to keep going to confirmation classes. After I finished up with those, I stopped going entirely. That's when my third OC moment happened. He fired all the women from every position in the church. The Sunday school teachers, the receptionist, every woman. That is, when he was fired, he packed up and left and took a group of around 40 people from our church with him. It was absolutely insane. Apparently the next pastor at our church was a nice dude, but I never wanted to find out. Well, there were a few OC moments. I was born and grew up Mormon, LDS cult. And well, despite my indoctrination and brainwashing, I was a rebellious child. Because I had friends outside the church, and I did a lot with them. I went to parties, put makeup on, high heels. I made always sure to be at home for church on Sunday mornings. If I dared to stay at a friend's house, my dad was really chill. My mother was rather a fanatic to that time. While the slut shaming was around my persona, I was a teen, and it should have raised the first doubts. The first came when I was 14 to 15. My family and 3 to 4 families went on a 8 days vacation, rented a huge house in the mountains, perfect for skiing and everything. They made groups for each task, like cooking, washing dishes, etc. So this one day, my dad and the bishop, both converts, went out to grocery shopping. That night we should have a ice cream as dessert. All kids were around the kitchen and the grown-ups were around, or helping in the kitchen. Suddenly drama erupts in the kitchen. Between all the vanilla, stracciatella, choco ice cream there was a coffee flavored tray of ice cream. To this day, I laugh at the thought of that ice cream. First a whole discussion arose on what to do with that ice cream. It was intense. One woman was getting hysterical just by having that coffee ice cream in the same house as her and her children. Yes, because coffee must be the devil in disguise. A faking debate started over a faking coffee ice cream tray. Anyhow, it ended when the bishop and my dad ate it. I did too. Why throwing perfectly good food away? There were pissed people, like demanding that the bishop in his position showed more respect to the Lord and the commandments. The others had the need to give a testimony, etc. Blah blah blah. I think that poor man was really looked down ever since because he dared to eat a coffee ice cream. Biggest what the fuck moment. Short version. Adult LDS people beached and whined about ice cream with I think 3% of coffee in it. Bishop, my dad and me ate it, causing people to doubt him as a religious leader. My dad got called out. I was the rebellious kid anyway. I typed this while enjoying a delicious coffee ice cream. Not really a cult, but the pastor of the church I grew up in was extremely conservative and definitely was trying to force his beliefs on us, which didn't exactly follow with the synod beliefs. Things that weren't a wake-up call, but probably should have been. A Father's Day sermon about how fathers turn their sons gay. I'll admit I probably wasn't actually paying attention to the sermons, or I would have been severely pissed off at this. A sermon after a baptism about how the child that was baptized should be considered dead, since he was now born again in Christ. I did find this extremely uncomfortable, but I feel like at that point, I was just kind of along for the ride. We didn't have confirmation, we had confirmation. Every document we were given saying that we were confirmed, the I was changed to an O, and it said we were conformed. Confirmation classes were basically sex ed classes that taught us that if we had sex out of wedlock we were committing sin, etc. The pastor refusing to baptize a child born out of wedlock. Right around the time the father of the child was going through confirmation classes, the pastor pretty much shunning his son / becoming extremely mad at his son when he decided to marry a Catholic girl, and I'm pretty sure got her pregnant out of wedlock. What was the awakening moment? He decided that for length the 1 year, he was going to preach about all sorts of sin / horrors in the Bible. One of them was about how being gay is a choice and gay people should die for their sins and will go to hell. I think this was my awakening moment, because it was not long after my best friend came out to me as gay. I couldn't fathom that the girl who I felt extremely close to and was always extremely nice would be going to hell. My cousin fell into that thinking for a while and kind of hounded me for thinking that being gay was okay. That was until one of his friends and coworkers came out as gay. I never officially left the church when that pastor was there, but a lot of other people did. We had gone from having 2 church services, where there was usually around 100 people at each service on a Sunday morning, when we first started going there, when I was 4, to having 60 people maximum at one church service by the time the pastor left, when I was 17 over 18. When he left, I volunteered for the call committee, the group of people who helps to appoint a new pastor to the church. I was happy to find a pastor who was much more liberal in his beliefs. I later ended up leaving that church anyway, because the pastor's wife got into an argument with my mom and basically shunned her out of the church. My opinion was that if they weren't going to welcome my mom, that was somewhere I didn't need to be. I wasn't born into it, as much as my family kept loose ties with this cult, until I was 14 years old. Around that time, my sister got curious and decided to join. Eventually I was pressured to join too. At first it seemed like a pleasant little place, where the old people were nice, the young people were boring, and there was the occasional threat of an imminent apocalypse that people seemed to really enjoy. Then I was asked to join the summer camp. Even though I was very much against the idea, I couldn't bear to break my mom's heart by refusing. It was my sister's second time there. She had already met some of the people. I was left completely alone, which is possibly one of the worst things that could happen to an awkward, anxious teenage boy. I was pretty much the church's favorite dish. Here are some of the oh shit, these people are crazy moments I experienced. Preaching me on how the artist I was listening to had made a deal with the devil and I should listen to the Christian version of it. 5 minutes after I arrived. Going to the beach on a cloudy day, start praying loudly in the middle of the beach until the sun began to shine through, and celebrate as if they were responsible for that. Pastors and other officials exploiting the usual teenagers' insecurities for faith. Fully brainwashing kids as young as 5 to commit to themselves. People claiming they had received visions of dying while helping some poor country in Africa and being ecstatic about it. Guess what? Now they leech off their parents and haven't done any of that, nor do they plan to. Being asked to donate 1/10 of my income, I replied I didn't even have a job yet, so they asked, what about your allowance? Spreading rumors that both me and my sister were possessed by something because I had tattoos and had mentioned drinking before. Fully investigating my life and private matters. These were my peers, mind you, not the church's officials. Chastising me because of my posts on private accounts in social media. Screaming, shouting, throwing themselves on the ground, and spasming every single time there was an assembly, claiming God had come over them. Making up fake speech, and shouting and later inform me they were speaking tongues. It really saddens me to say that I didn't quit on any of these moments. I eventually quit when my sister needed a place to stay for 2 weeks. 2 of the church goers / friends of hers offered their place without any mention of fees, only to ask my family €200 after my sister left, like it was nothing. Mind you, my family had just been robbed of everything we had, and they were well aware of this fact. I was not a church goer until the age of 5, when my family suddenly became Catholic. I learned of Jesus. I liked the idea, but I always saw the church the same way I saw Santa. Fun, but unbelievable. Out of respect to my parents and my youthful desire to believe, I dedicated myself to the Catholic lifestyle. I went to church twice a week at school and every Sunday with my family. Around 7th grade I began going to a non-denominational church, now considered a mega church, with my cousins, and I really liked it. Not because they presented Jesus in a different light, but everyone seemed to be happier and overall better people. I went to the youth group and shared stories of my Catholic background, and at the end of the youth group meeting, they all laid their hands on me and prayed that I saw the light of Christ and left my awful blasphemous church. I was stunned. I was taught Catholicism is Christianity, and that all Christianity stemmed from Catholicism. I kept it to myself and mulled it over. I was distraught. I shared this information with another friend at my Catholic school. They told their parents, who contacted the school and told them I had been baptized by another church outside of Catholicism. The following day the priest calls me into his office and screams at me for a solid 2.5 hours to the point of tears, and does not allow me to speak. Tells me I should be excommunicated from the church for being submersed in another church's waters, and that I should have to pay every penny discounted from my tuition for being Catholic. I finally got to speak and informed him I had not been baptized, but simply went to church with my cousin who isn't Catholic, at a time where they encouraged us to accept all other religions. He called my mother and told her I shouldn't be allowed to go to church with my cousins anymore. I'm 13 at the time and rather intelligent, and this completely broke me. I had no more faith in either side. Christians vs Christians? Catholics vs Christians? No thank you. I'll just be nice to people and hope to do well in the world. This took a faking toll on me to keep the secret through the rest of my Catholic education. I buried it down inside though, until I finally left Catholic school my senior year. I have been to church once with my mother, since to appease her I'm still open to believing in something. I'm just waiting to come across something that makes me a believer, I guess. 4 years as a child I would go to church every Sunday and be brought down into a basement with a bunch of other kids and listen to these amazing stories about people doing magic tricks, surviving worldwide floods, wandering the desert, splitting giant waterways in two, and fighting giant cyclops with a rock. And it was great. 8-year-old me was very entertained every Saturday. Then I had a party when I was 11ish and got a bunch of money and gifts and stuff from people I went to church with to celebrate me being old enough to go to the adult church. The next week I went to church and realized that the adults are also listening to the same stories, but taking them way too seriously. Then my mom gave me $3 and told me it wasn't for me, but for the collection plate, and it all hit me that church was not what I needed to be doing with my life. The next few weeks on Saturday I would go to a friend's house to spend the night and not have to go to church on Sundays. I later got my dad to admit that he only went because his family convinced him that he needed to have me go. We then skipped a few weeks and eventually my whole family just kind of stopped going. To add to the negative effects of the cult part of it, a girl in my Sunday school and regular school class would later tell me about a program called Swimming with Jesus, which led to her being made fun of because she was so serious about it, and then later she was homeschooled because of the bullying. She's a stripper now. A good one. I'm actually somewhat involved in a cult now. I'm trying to get out, but it is difficult for a few reasons. Basically, I'm in high school and my parents are Pentecostal. Every Sunday we go to a Pentecostal church. Somewhere around December 2016 I realized that I had never heard God's voice in any way. I had prayed to him so many times, but he never said anything to me. So I gave up on prayer because why should I talk to someone who doesn't want to talk to me? I then became more open to other religions and non-religions. Over a 4-month period I started watching atheism videos on YouTube. Specifically, Thunderf 00 tons. Through math, science, and logically showed me just how silly my beliefs were. I deconverted into atheism, and in about a week I will have been one for a year or so. About a month after deconversion some traveling preachers were visiting the church. I wanted to know if God really was real despite what science shows, and responding to their altar call. Why? Everyone who went fell in the spirit. If it isn't real, then how come so many people fell? I went up there, and he prayed for me. I didn't fall. There was no rush of love or whatever happens. I didn't fall, and didn't have to be caught. That shattered my faith, and I don't think I will ever go back in my heart. Why can't I get out? Because of my parents mostly. I haven't told them I'm an atheist. It would break their hearts and make them feel like they are failures as parents, which is not something I want to do. I've asked my dad if I can stay home from church, and he has always said no, except for when there is a good reason like sickness, because that's what our family does. I wouldn't classify it as a cult, but close enough. I was raised Pentecostal. The pastor, when I was a teenager, was a woman. She had a serious authority complex. My cousin and I were little hellions. I wore a Metallica t-shirt to youth group once. The next 4 youth group meetings, we had to watch a 4-part VHS series on the evils of rock and roll. It was like a B-roll documentary from the 1980s where people played records backwards and made it sound like it was saying Hail Satan. It was faking dumb. Then we went to an event called Acquire the Fire. It was a Christian concert / event / whatever you call it. At this concert, they preached about the evils of secular music. They went down the aisles of the stadium with trash cans and everyone was expected to throw away their worldly CDs. I was smarter than the average teen and brought blank CDRs labeled with a Sharpie. Some kids threw away stacks of real CDs that would have cost their parents hundreds of dollars. I'm pretty sure every one of those trash cans ended up at the closest pawn shop, sold for cash. It was bullshit. Everything about youth group was about control. It was an attempt to brainwash the kids into becoming good little Pentecostals who don't question their pastor. I'm actually pretty happy I grew up in that situation. It taught me many valuable lessons, like how to manipulate people. I made it my life mission to see that Beach voted out of her position as pastor. I held little meetings with the other kids and planted little seeds in their minds. I got about half of them on my side and the other half were the goody two-shoes types who were too cowardly to question authority. I got all my minions to start complaining to their parents about the way she treated everyone. Not lies, just making small honest complaints. Eventually, the moms started mentioning to each other that their kids weren't happy with how she was treating everyone in youth group. Once the moms started talking, the gossip began. If there's one thing church folk are good at, it's gossip. Elections are held every year by anonymous written vote. The pastor must have 2/3 majority of the vote to remain pastor. She didn't get it. She was pissed. She went off on a long rant and showed everyone her true colors. She had to be escorted from the building. It was the happiest day of my life. Our next pastor was so much better. He was a lot cooler. He had tattoos, and he understood why teens like rock music. I don't attend anymore, but he's still the pastor now, probably 15 years later. I believe that any organized religion that tells you how to live your life and takes things like money from you is a cult. That being said, I was about 15-year-old when I told my mother that I didn't want to go to Sunday Mass anymore. We were devout Catholics. I had been baptized into the church, made my first communion, and was about to make my confirmation. That would signify my adulthood in the Catholic Church. We lived in a small town in upstate New York, and our town was the archdiocese of the county, so basically Catholic Central. That church ruled that town for a very long time. It literally broke my mother's heart when I told her I didn't want anything to do with the Catholic Church anymore. I'm sure she went to church that day and prayed for my soul for hours on end. I can't remember any time never being a part of the church. I went to Catholic school. I was an altar boy who served the bishop of our county in his private morning masses at the diocese. I was deep into the church even at such a young age. My aha moment was when I heard my mother tell me that she must give a certain amount of money in the collection at mass when the basket came around. I didn't realize that the Catholic Church told its parish how much money they had to give. It was a certain percentage of their weekly income. Then I took a good look at the church itself with all its pompous circumstance, golden jewel encrusted chalice, and its marble altars, its grand cathedral frame and its stained glass. This in itself to me was breaking the second and third commandments, taking God's name in vain and worshipping idols. Jesus preached his father's name on the back of a borrowed donkey or something. I'm sure he asked for nothing from his followers, but only love and faith. I was done. Since then, around 1985, the Catholic Church has seen its share of decline and scandal, but my mother is still as devout as she ever was. I told her my thoughts on the reason for leaving, but it went right over her head. Anyway, that's my story. I do feel even the mainstream religions are cults to a certain degree. Not particularly born into that specific church I left, but was born Anglican Christian. Left the church I knew all my life to attend another that was more appealing to 14-year-old me. Rock music during worship, the occasional pyrotechnics, great visuals, friends, feeling like I was doing something meaningful. Sign me up. That charismatic youth church provided me with friends and a community that I didn't have at school. So it was a sanctuary of sorts. Everything was fine and dandy until, notably, 3 things happened. Among other things, when the pastors' birthdays rolled around, the different arts ministries had to band together to create a massive song and dance concert thing for them. A performance bigger than the Second Coming. So imagine we'd have a huge event with the pastors, husband and wife, sat in the middle of the auditorium. Quite a waste of energy and time, if you ask me. We were required to pledge a certain amount that God told us to for their building fund. The medium-sized auditorium, maybe 2,000 pax, was getting too small for the burgeoning numbers of brainwashed young ones. They needed to relocate. They encouraged fasting to scrimp on lunch money to give to the church's personal sacrifice. I remember mates who weren't so well off skipping brekkie, lunch and dinner altogether, and living on cheap nutritional bars, all in the name of tithing. So our pastors could continue to wear Ed Hardy clothes. Bearing in mind 80% of the congregation were school-going people. When I left the church, they held a leaders meeting and humiliated me in front of everyone. Also, they told me to leave the building or else security would escort me, and they told me never to contact anyone ever again. I have given years of my life going to church every Saturday and Sunday, and also during the week sometimes as well. 3. This wasn't really instigated by the church, but my own folks. My old man is extremely devout, however he has a massive temper. When I was younger he would beat me up and slap me around, so much so that I wouldn't be able to head to school. He would also call me nasty things, and my mum would rather leave him to do his thing or else she would get it as well. Once she intervened, and he blamed her for enabling me to rebel and not showing him respect. When he simmered down, he would apologize and explain that the Lord told him to disciple me and pull out the children must obey the Lord card. I hate that he would pretend to be proud of me, boasting about me getting my master's from a reputable UK university, whilst being a complete hypocrite privately, not turning up for my graduation because it was too expensive and he was lazy. He also told my gay best friend to pray the gay away. I've always pictured Christians to be non-judgmental, however the judgment emanating from my dad could fuel 1,000 courtrooms. My oh shit moment came when I read a book about stage magic that encouraged the questioning of beliefs and demonstrated how easy we are to fool and how magic relies on us fooling ourselves by making assumptions. I realized the belief system I was in had no good reason for believing it. That wasn't just wishful thinking and it making me feel good and wanting it to be true. Belief systems are viral memoplexes that spread horizontally through the population and also unfortunately vertically down into offspring. They exist and have the properties and effects they do to non-consciously ensure their own survival. In the same way that genes do point the tools they use are logical constructs that manipulate our emotions. They use our fear of death and of wanting a purpose. They promise amazing rewards for spreading them and threaten dire consequences for merely disbelieving them. Any belief system that feels good to believe and threatens punishment for disbelief and compels you to install it into your children, as well as trying to get others to accept it, is likely a selfish memoplex out for its own survival point. There may be men at the top making money, or there may not. Those aren't the real people in control anyway. A belief system may have been intelligently designed by people to profit from others, or it may have just been naturally selected and evolved from other traditions and belief systems. Our brains and minds, with all their hopes and fears, are a ripe environment for a new kind of replicator to exploit. Not of chemical sequences that produces physical effects on the world to create bodies that replicate that chemical sequence, but of states of neurons that produces effects on bodies and minds to replicate that state of neurons in other brains. It's the best explanation for cults and religions I've read that explains how they can be so arbitrarily different, yet share common features. We're easily fooled. I consider American Christianity and its 2,000 sects a series of similar cults. I was born to a family rendered dumb and ineffective by blind devotion to barely understood principles inexplicably adhered to with dimly aware southern apathy. The hypocrisy and stolid daily cognitive dissonance took a heavy and immeasurable toll on formative me and directly shaped my worldview and a lot of my moral compass and coping mechanisms. To say I was ill prepared doesn't even begin to properly illustrate my own mind's inability to reconcile the spewed bile I had been raised with my own interpretations of the world around me. Finally came to a pernicious head around the age of 15. Despite claiming moral superiority over all other mindsets and faiths, my family exhibited noticeable racial bias in daily interactions. Unnecessary vitriol towards any notion of homosexuality in any form, spouted generalizations about sights unseen and placed unvisited, but most alarmingly to me, they supposed as fact aloud constantly. Actions never squared with proclamation. So during the summer of my 15th year I failed to keep up my pleasant facade. I notified my family I would no longer be attending their services or taking part in their rituals. I was surprised by how easily my mother seemed to accept my departure. Both of my parents punished me by verbal lecture for days. But it had become clear to me at long last that they had no actual power, so I moved out. I didn't return to my little Appalachian hometown physically for 8 years. I didn't travel extensively, but I did travel, my travels confirming what I had suspected for years, which was that I had grown up in a tiny enclave of mountain-surrounded willful ignorance. These people had raised me to not wonder what was beyond the mountains, to render judgment upon anything beyond the smoky veil harshly and sweepingly. And most importantly, I realized that my hometown was different, not the rest of the world. It's taken me years and years to understand how I was raised as having been what I now classify as weird cult shit. Thinking of my experience along those definitions helped me to square with a lot of it emotionally in some healthy ways. But these days I'm proud to have come to conclusions about myself and the world around me on my own. I didn't take the word of some nutty weird people and sit quietly, incurious and satisfied. I couldn't point and what you're all saying about being educated out of it rings especially true for me. I've been told that wanting to be educated is what makes my generation X worthless by folks who have never left their birth county. Women who didn't just shut up and have babies are uppity and worthless. Men who weren't John Wayne clones were gay. No in between. You're either rightly devout or the devil himself. Program black and white think. Individuality not just discouraged, but openly loathed. Be quiet. Have babies. Pay taxes. Generalize anyone who doesn't adhere. Preach one thing, live the complete opposite, and lambaste and vilify anyone who simply observes this fact aloud. It was like a cognitive dissonance pressure cooker for years. I'm better now, because I have a child of my own. Same family is trying to program him, and instill racial bias and outsider fear, religious dogma and tribalism. It doesn't seem to be faking him up too badly just yet, but it's their point. I try my best not to preach, but to just be a good example. Something I was never given. To me that's progress. Edit. Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth or one's lifetime. Mark Twain. As a person with a friend who is a JW and absolutely hates his life, what should I do to help him escape the situation he's in? It feels terrible not being able to help him. He was born into the religion, and so were the entirety of his family. I think JW only marry other JW, but he has one cousin that has managed to leave. Oddly enough, she's currently the only one under 20. Since his sexuality is frowned upon by religion, and he wants to become an actor for a living, the choices he makes are putting him at risk at losing almost everyone he believes he loves right now. His parents used to try and dissuade him from becoming an actor. They wrote him a 3-page letter where they explained how he should carry on learning violin as it's a key part of a young man's education. He hates it. Could possibly take up becoming a drama teacher because they don't think he's good enough at anything to make it, and have decided they want him to be a banker. After a year of this, now that he is going through his GCSEs, they outright threatened him. If you leave, you'll never see your grandparents again. The school might even kill your grandfather, or you'll lose everyone and everything you love. It pains me every time he comes in talking of a new way they've ruined him. His grandparents are supportive of whatever choices he makes, but whatever choices he actually does make will result in him losing access to them, but access to the world. As a result of everything his parents have done, his mental health is like a blanket after a shootout. He self-harms regularly so that he can feel control of something, anything in his life. What do I do? How am I meant to help resolve this situation? My sheet moment was when Obama and Clinton bombed the shit out of Libya, continued the drone war, and increased military spending in 2000. I supported NADA and felt guilty after Bush, so I voted Democrat. Obama talked a good game, but ended up being closer to Reagan than FDR on economic issues. Another sheet moment was when my insurance tripled in 3 years under Obamacare. I still am glad I personally got it, but it is clear that single payer is way better. Learning the left is really the right was my sheet moment. Besides Sanders and a few others, the left does not exist in the USA anymore. We have nothing but right-wing Democrats and extreme right-wing Republicans. FDR compromised with the Republicans in the top tax bracket 93%. He started at 100%. Now Democrats settle for 35%. Next they will run on increasing taxes and then only increase it to 39%. Hoop-de-doo. The left actually exists in Europe. They have free healthcare, tons of vacation, free college, prisons that rehabilitate people instead giving them PTSD. They have family leave, affordable family care. They do not spend as obscene amounts on military. Many oppose war. Not to say Europe is not without fault. European banks still rob people blind and inequality can still be vastly improved.